Hello, hello, hello. YouTube deserves a little intro music, right? Hey, everybody. It's me, Briahna, and I am here to talk to you about today's new episode. Hello, hello, hello. It's good to see everybody. It was really exciting. It's always such a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk to Congress members. I know we on the left are often consternated that the people that we worked so hard to elect and with whom we have the closest political ideology so rarely frequent left news outlets, which disempowers us as compared to right news outlets where any little old person can get, Donald Trump on the air, right? And left media outlets, even our biggest allies, tend to treat us like the plague. I was going to say the plague, but honestly, it feels weird to say that when there's, actual COVID happening. But I will say that Ro Khanna is, a king among men when it comes to a willingness to sit in front of progressive audiences and answer questions. And I really appreciate that he was willing to do that for the third time on Bad Faith. Just FYI, this is the third time. I believe the last time he was on the podcast, that was a premium episode. So if you want to go and check that out, you can always go over to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and unlock what are now, I guess, 80 plus premium episodes that are back there. And I will intro us in today. Max is just getting his call-in set up. So if you have questions, go to the call-in app. You can call in there and talk to us directly. I see that there is a queue already queued up as per usual. But let's start by playing a clip from today's episode to orient us. For those who haven't already watched it, the full interview is up on Bad Faith YouTube. A reminder that you should also like the video, subscribe to the podcast, and hit the notification bell. People have been saying that Bad Faith hasn't been showing up in their feeds. We all know there's been a scourge of blacklisting and full-on censorship across lefty media, and that the algorithm, generally speaking, is not friendly to non-corporate outlets. So to the extent that you can support in that way, even if you can't support financially, Max put out. Oops, sorry about that. It is much appreciated. So I'm going to queue up this first clip, and I want to hear from you guys on call-in. Let me share my screen real quick. Sorry, I'm doing this all by myself. All right, here we go.
Max put out something calling me a neocon because of my position on Ukraine, and I thought that was ridiculous.
It wasn't saying you are a neocon. It's saying that this is language that sounds like what a neocon would say to justify any number of interventions.
When people say the United States role, what specifically was the United States role?
The hard evidence that most people point to most concretely is leaked calls of Victoria Nuland.
I think Yats is the guy.
Why should voters believe that electing more Democrats is going to change anything?
You don't think that if we had a few more Democratic senators, that would make a difference? Because that's really been...
I don't. I am troubled by the rebranding of what it means to be progressive and what the progressive agenda is. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently gave an interview where she said the Democrats are in trouble for not pursuing some of these popular agenda items. You disagreed. All right, I'll take this first question from Cat Purple, who says, when you asked him what pushing Biden looks like, he was stunned to actually have been asked a real question on what his words meant. Yeah, I mean, look, we know what the media is like, and we know that very infrequently do people have to substantiate what it is that they're saying. I mean, last time Representative Khanna was on the podcast, I asked him about rotating villain theory. I had actually forgotten about that until I went back and listened to the interview after I had conducted this one yesterday. And he acknowledged it back then, but there's no follow-up. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't manifest in anything. It doesn't cut through, it doesn't undermine their ability to keep pretending like there's an electoral solution without a substantive reform. Because what is, in my view, really missing from our electoral process is elected Democrats challenging other elected Democrats directly on that kind of BS. We just don't see that. Like, categorically, we don't see that. I might get someone to acknowledge the possibility, the reality of the rotating villain stuff, but they're never going to go and call Joe Manchin out on that basis. Another moment in the interview that was very similar was when I asked, why is it? What do those conversations actually look like when you're asking Joe Biden about student debt cancellation and his rationale for not doing it? And he touts this idea that there's some issue about there being constitutional. No, there's not. There's not an issue about it being constitutional. That's bullshit. That's like me saying scientists disagree about whether or not carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that causes global warming. Like, they don't disagree. They don't. You're gaslighting people. It's manufactured ambiguity the same way there was around the parliamentarian battle around $15 minimum wage. And to Ro's credit, as he said, he was someone who was pushing for the $15 minimum wage to be included in the COVID bill last spring. But pushing for it, saying, I wish this were the case, is not the same thing as calling out members of your own party who know better and talking about the conversations that are happening behind closed doors. If you can't tell me a conversation that you've had with Biden, a senior official, a Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, somebody, in which they articulated to you their constitutional concerns, and you articulated back a counter response, and you are able to talk about what's actually happening, I don't want to hear it. It's just platitudes. It looks like Max is good to go. Are you good to go, Max? You give me a thumbs up? Oh, he's not. Okay, all right. Let's add Max to the stream. Welcome, Max.
How's it going?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. First time caller, long time listener.
Right back at you. I can't believe this is the first time we've actually spoken.
Hopefully not the last.
Absolutely.
Am I doing the call in thing right?
Yes, I'm going over there right now, and I'm going to pull you up. I'm going to pull you up onto the stage so that the call-in audience can hear you. Can you get in the caller queue so it's a little easier to find you, Max?
All right. People are saying they can't hear me.
Yeah, that's because you're not actually up on you're not on the stage on call-in. You're only up on YouTube.
So what do I do?
Wait, where did you just go?
I called in, so I should be.
Yeah, but I'm going to invite you to speak. So I'm inviting you up to stage now. Now, if you unmute yourself and call in, accept and unmute yourself, and everyone should be able to hear you.
Can everyone hear me?
I think you're still muted in call-in. There's a little button in the bottom right that looks like a.
All right. Now y'all should be able to hear me.
Yes.
1 2 1 2. What's up, call in? I don't have time to do a show there, so.
You thought about doing a show?
They asked me to do a show, but I'm doing so many other things, and it leaves me with no time to write, and I'm editing like 17 writers already. So
I get that. I don't write, so that's the truth.
I miss writing.
I do too. It's a constant juggle, but I'm glad to have you here today, Max. So I saw the interaction between you and Ro, and that's what made me immediately reach out to his camp and see if he would come on the podcast at the beginning of this month. And so it was a primary motivator for us to even have this conversation. What did you make of his response to my questions about how the tweet that followed up your line of questioning to him that day?
Well, I actually wasn't able to give his response my undivided attention because I was busy downloading all the call-in software. But
no, we can listen to it if you'd like.
Yeah. Let's run it back.
Let's cue it up real quick. Okay. So here we go. Let me play this fuller part of the interview, because obviously we create these clips and they circulate on Twitter, but I think it's really worth hearing the substance of this part of the conversation. I'm gonna have to fish around for it just a little bit, but let me share my screen. I'm sorry, I really should have a producer that helps me with some of these things, and I would if you subscribe to Patreon and enable me to pay for one. I'm going to share. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to start sharing this other screen. Here we go.
whether it's others in Europe, whether it's other parties,
right,
to say, how do we bring a diplomatic end to this war?
I think we're still sidestepping this issue of what America, another $30 billion.
Diplomatic.
Always 100% in defense of the administration. I'm very critical on Yemen. But on Russia, I think this president has gotten the policy right.
Earlier this month, reporter Max Blumenthal asked you a similar line of questions about why Ukraine, why send weapons to Ukraine, and why intervene here when there's so many other conflicts in the global context that America chooses not to intervene in. How can we trust that this is something other than a strategic choice rather than a moral one, especially given the United States' long-term involvement in the region? Earlier, you mentioned that this should be between. You contrasted the fault as being 100% Putin's fault and not Ukraine's fault. But the real question that much of the left is asking is the extent to which this is a combined result of both Putin's actions and the United States and NATO's long-term actions. And when Max Blumenthal raised some of those issues to you and put this video out,
prices are already going up massively because of the sanctions, inflation's going up, and that's all to fight Russia. I mean, that's the message Biden and his people are sending. Don't you think? I mean, do you think Americans? What skin in the game do Americans have for Ukraine?
Americans have the skin in the game to stand up for freedom, to stand up for human rights. We've always done that as a nation, and we want to make sure that we stand up for Europe and NATO, and we stand up to bullies. I mean, people see on television Putin killing children, killing mothers. I mean, it's horrific. And we as an America, we are the greatest nation in the world. We've always stood up for freedom. We stand up for human rights.
So raising inflation and raising oil prices for freedom.
I don't think that's connected. I think the reason that people are paying $5 at the pump and $6 at the pump is because these big oil companies are profiting billions of dollars.
You responded with a since-deleted tweet that said, "The far left's refusal to condemn the immoral and illegal Putin invasion is appalling. It's nihilistic relativism. I stand on my words in this exchange and reject Max Blumenthal and RT Talking Points, where he's a contributor. I have human rights progressive approach to FP, to foreign policy." Do you stand by that tweet? Why did you delete that tweet?
I do. I don't think it's deleted. I stand by it. Because I stand by it. It was in response. Max put out the...
I'll stop it just to confirm. He was so confident that I didn't feel like pressing it in the moment, but it is in fact a deleted tweet.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. We'll keep
going. They're calling me a neocon because of my position on Ukraine. And I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, anyone who knows my career, my advocacy against the first Iraq war, my advocacy against the invasion of Libya, my advocacy in Yemen would certainly not describe me as a neocon. He put that tweet out, and it was in response to that tweet that I put it up. But it should still be up. I think people can just go on Twitter and find it. And I absolutely stand by it 100% because I thought his characterization that I believe that Ukraine should be able to defend itself in a just war, that somehow that makes me a neocon, was just wrong.
So Max's tweet that you're responding to read, "After campaigning on a peace platform, Ro Khanna sounds like a Bush-era neocon, spouting American exceptionalist bromides about freedom not being free."
I stand by it. I said that Ukraine is standing up for its territorial sovereignty. They're in a just war. We should stand with them. We should provide them with weapons. I distinguish that from wars which I have been opposed to, like Iraq, which I didn't think was a war that was justified. I was for the initial invasion in Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda, but then I thought it wasn't worth staying there for 20 years to see one Taliban government replaced by another 20 Taliban government. Here, I think the Ukrainians should fight for their homeland, and that it is a just war, and that it is appropriate for the United States to give weapons. And so I stand by that position.
But I think what Max was responding to was he asked a question about the rising cost to Americans of sanctioning Russia and the massive package of arms authorized for Ukraine, right? So he was talking about two things: whether or not the sanctions are effective and whether the downsides for American citizens are worth it, and two, whether or not the United States should be sending arms, regardless of whether or not you think somebody else is fighting a just war. There is this fundamental imperialist question of whether or not the United States should be the one advancing those goals, providing arms to people, regardless of whether they're neo-Nazis or not. Any number of regimes across the world that has taken and done all kinds of things that we now, in retrospect, regret with American war power. And the response, the reaction to the response had to do with a kind of language that felt like the kind of same pat jingoistic language that we're used to hearing from traditional conservative corporate Democrats and Republicans, not from someone like yourself, talking about freedom and just wars, or the kind of vague concepts that very easily get weaponized to justify any number of interventions around the world. And so for your response to then go to calling out him, his integrity, because of his relationship with Russia Today, like RT, and instead of engaging substantively with the concern, I think that is what triggered people, for lack of better words. What do you say to that?
Well, I stand by the language in that clip. I mean, I engaged with it for almost a minute. I mean, I answer almost any question. I do believe America is an exceptional country, on the way to becoming the first multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. I've said that since
American exceptionalism and America being an exceptional country, you know that those are two different concepts, right?
Yeah, but that's all I said on the clip. I've said that my whole career. I genuinely believe.
You can tell me to stop and jump in anytime, Max, by the way.
I mean, yeah, we can just, I guess I'm ready to respond. First of all, I mean, you did a really good job questioning him. It almost seems like you have a legal background or something. I mean, you left him with very little room to escape there. The one thing that, I mean, but he told two falsehoods. He spouted two serious falsehoods, though, in the course of that exchange. First, that he did not delete his tweet.
Right.
It was deleted after he was completely ratioed. And, and it doesn't matter if you get ratioed if you really believe that you're right and you want to show resolve, as he seems to want to do. And he really seems to be hippie punching here and punching left to show that he's a serious contender on the national stage. But he also, as you mentioned, he tried to go after my integrity. I didn't say anything about his wife owning arms industry stock. Owning $50,000 of stock in General Dynamics, which has been one of the major suppliers of the Saudi military to carry out one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world in Yemen. I didn't say anything about that to him. But he said I'm an RT contributor. I mean, I go on RT and like I've done 2 or 3 interviews for them in the last 3 months. But it's impossible for me to be a contributor because RT America doesn't exist. When they ask me for interviews, I sometimes go on and, I only go on to talk about my work. The same way I go on CGTN, I'll go on occasionally Press TV, the Iranian network. I go on Al Jazeera, the Qatari network. I go on Al Mayadeen to speak to people in the Middle East. It's an Arabic network, whatever. So what he's trying to say, he's playing pure McCarthyism and he's playing into the most disgusting aspects of Beltway culture right now, where anyone who disagrees with this drive to World War III and escalation with Russia and the whole obsession with destroying diplomacy with a fellow nuclear armed power and driving NATO troops and NATO weapon systems, dual-use missiles onto Russia's border and antagonizing it. Anyone who questions that is a Russian agent. That's what Ro Khanna is playing into. So that, really is revealing. I expected something slightly different from him.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. At one point, I did ask him follow-up questions about what he thought about RT and RT being banned.
Straight up banned.
And he seemed to be not super familiar with it having happened, and then seemed skeptical that people would need RT as a voice to have a platform, given that there's all the mainstream media options. And when I pushed back and pointed out the fact that people like, who are very credible and respected, like Chris Hedges, are not welcomed on mainstream TV and do have shows on RT. And, I pointed out, he was like, well, if you're a tenured professor, you should be able to get on TV. I said, well, he is a professor at Princeton University and he's not. And moreover, people like Cornel West have articulated how infrequently they are invited on these mainstream shows. And he seemed to be genuinely surprised by that, which I found to be genuinely surprising.
Well, these members of Congress are really ignorant. about what happens in alternative media. They're ignorant about international affairs. And his comments to me when I caught him stepping out of a cafe on Capitol Hill, I was just walking around looking for members of Congress to interview about the Ukraine escalation and what the U.S. should do. And I think that's what all reporters should be doing. But instead, what reporters do now is like basically advanced State Department talking points, just like these members of Congress do. And he just displayed incredible ignorance. I have this echo in my ear from the call-in app.
Call-in.
Hold on, I'm trying to turn it down, but it won't go down all the way. It's really distracting.
And for some reason, I stopped being able to see the chat. The chat stopped scrolling for me, so I can't really tell if everything's going on over there. There was an echo a second ago. I'm sorry, guys. I had you guys plugged into the wrong. I didn't have you plugged into my Rode device, but I'm hoping now it's okay. If someone wants to tell me how things are sounding over on Callin in the YouTube chat, I would appreciate that. But
they're still saying there's a bad echo. Damn.
I don't know what to.
You know what? The echo is coming from my speakers. So I don't actually know how we can do both of these at once because it's coming from my computer speakers into the mic.
Can you put earphones on?
I've got earphones.
Do you have a wired earphone that you can attach from the computer to your head? Old school style?
Yeah, actually, I do. Okay. All right. This is just going to be crazy.
Okay.
Right.
What I'm dying to know, Max, is so I'm someone who obviously does not have a foreign policy background, and I've been doing like crash course Ukraine for the past 4 weeks and trying to listen to everything that I can and hear all the sides of the thing and come to my own conclusions. But what would really be helpful from my perspective is if someone like you and Representative Khanna were in the same room and could talk to each other and get that direct feedback instead of me feeling like I have to like funnel what you and people like Aaron Mate are saying to what other people are saying, like Ro Khanna and some of the guests that we've had on the show recently, and play this in-between role. Because I'm not as good at it. I'm not ever going to press as specifically as you would in those instances.
We're going to try this. I got like this echo. I'm not going to be able to do call-in anymore. So I'm just going to have to.
Okay, no worries. You know what I'm going to tell the call-in audience? Call-in, I'm going to leave you on if you want to be on, but you're not going to be able to hear Max. Go to YouTube to listen, and I will take questions from call-in shortly, and I will be able to hear the questions.
You know what I'm going to do? Actually, what I'm going to try to do, let me go off these headphones and try to run call-in on speaker. The sound won't be as good with me, but let's see what happens. All right, now I have a terrible echo. This is insane. All right, this is like the worst shit ever. All right.
It's okay.
Leave. Leave room. I'm out of here. Sorry, guys.
It's okay. It's all right.
All right.
So I think that it might be. I think that the call-in you might be coming through the computer to call in now anyway. Okay, it's good now. It's good. They can hear you through my Rode through the computer. So that's good. You won't be able to hear their questions, but I can pass them on if it comes to that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I wasn't prepared in advance, but just to respond to your last question, and I mean the content really is what's important here more than the platforms. I would have, Ro Khanna would never get in a room with me and allow any live debate. None of these people would, and that's why for years I've been going up in the Capitol to grill members about various U.S. foreign policy interventions, regime change attempts. I managed to catch AOC on Venezuela. She really didn't have a good answer for me. And I'm polite about the whole thing. I'm no longer allowed in the Capitol now. They have this phony excuse that you can't go in because of COVID. Unless you have an invitation from a member. So if I was displaying symptoms of COVID and sneezing all over the place and coughing everywhere, but a member invited me in, I would be allowed in the Capitol. But if I don't, now you have to, and now I'm totally healthy, but I'm not allowed in. So I can't just go into the so-called people's house that was so holy on January 6th. I can't go in there. So I find them on the streets. And I just walked the streets of Capitol Hill. I saw Ro go into a cafe, and I had this debate, and I think it was very productive for all your viewers and for Americans in general to see someone who ran on a peace platform sounding like a neocon. He literally said we need to tank the U.S. economy, or not literally, but effectively said we need to tank the U.S. economy in order to show resolve against Putin. And I'll come back to that point in a second, but I think it's important to say that Ro Khanna used to have different foreign policy staff in his office. And I know them, I would talk to them, and they would use my work on the plague of neo-Nazism in Ukraine, and specifically the fact that basically the entire Ukrainian National Guard consisted of literal neo-Nazis like the Azov Battalion, who wear neo-Nazi symbols on their uniforms, who revere Stepan Bandera, who is a Nazi collaborator responsible for numerous pogroms in World War II, as well as Roman Shukevich, another Ukrainian partisan army leader who helped carry out the Lviv pogrom. This was during the Holocaust of Bullets. I mean, these are their heroes. They, are openly fascist, and they have been engaged in an unjust war against the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine, and specifically in the Donbass. They've killed so many civilians who are ethnic Russian over the last 8 years. This is a war Ukraine's post-Maidan US-imposed government has been waging in the east of its country. And it's a deeply unjust war. And Ro Khanna's staff got that while the US was going to be arming the Ukrainian regular military, and that was just a thing it was going to do, what they could do to start de-escalating the conflict as a progressive member of Congress is to impose a block in the defense appropriations bill, the NDAA, every year on arming the Azov Battalion specifically. John Conyers, the late John Conyers, actually started that initiative. And then Ro Khanna actually carried it out, got it done in 2018, and tweeted about it, that it's disgusting that Ukraine incorporates neo-Nazis into its regular military through the National Guard, and we need to stop arming it. And his staff would tell me, like, we love your work. Like, thank you for informing us on this. They're gone. They're not in his office. And he, rented out, it looks like he rented out his brain to somebody else. And it may have national ambitions. So,
that came up during the interview. And in fact, he raised the prohibition, the prohibition against arms going to the Azov Battalion, specifically in the interview, as a defense of me raising the concerns about who we are in fact arming. To me, I almost want to sidestep the conversation, because I feel like so many factions on the left are spending a lot of time arguing about exactly how many Nazis there are and how relevant it is, which is already a really gross place to be in. The fact that, they don't have to be Nazis for me to have issues arming them first and foremost. And so I opened the interview asking him this more abstract question, this more philosophical question about how you decide what the litmus test for the left should be, to the extent that anybody on the left agrees that there might be a moment where it is appropriate and moral and perhaps even necessary, morally required for us to provide arms to somebody. This kind of like World War II example that looms over everybody's heads. What the litmus test of that should be, because he keeps evoking this idea of a just war. It's a plainly just war, and nobody seems to be willing to define that.
Well, what he seems to be saying or suggesting, and if you go around Capitol Hill in DC right now, or some of the wealthier, like affluent, monolithically white neighborhoods in DC, you're going to see Ukrainian flags fluttering over homes. They finally found their Palestinians and their white people like them. That's really what's going on here. And they believe that these are innocent victims who are being tormented and invaded. And, it is an invasion by the military behemoth of evil Vladimir Putin. And, many people watching this, you may oppose Russia's military attack on Ukraine. I'm not here to dispute that, but what it does is deprive people of the context of the last 8 years, where NATO has used Ukraine and Ukraine's military as a base for assaulting ethnic Russians in Ukraine, including in core Ukrainian cities like Odessa, where close to 100 ethnic Russians were burned alive in a trade union building by neo-Nazis who were being weaponized by the Ukrainian SBU, the intelligence services, because they protested the Maidan coup, the US-backed color revolution that had taken place in Kiev. And then 14,000 have died in the Donbass, around Donetsk and Lugansk, these separatist pro-Russian republics. And according to the UN, since 2017, over 80% of the dead have been on the pro-Russian side. So many of them have been civilians. And we've seen, even in the course of this war, Ukraine's military lobbing missiles into the center of Donetsk and killing civilians who are riding buses. I mean, this has just been going on, and no one has been saying anything. No one has been saying anything except us in alternative media for 8 years. And those doing the bulk of the fighting and carrying out the most vicious attacks have been the far right or neo-Nazi forces. They're the ones who are the most ideologically motivated. They're the ones who provided the muscle on Maidan Square in 2014. And they were there battling the Ukrainian riot police, the Berkut, trying to carry out a violent regime change attempt, basically while Senator Chris Murphy and John McCain were there. They were there on the square. And who is standing? Let me just make this quick point.
Sure.
Who is standing next to McCain and Chris Murphy, a progressive from Connecticut? It was a guy named Ole Tianbach, who is the leader of the Svoboda Party. This is a party that used to be known as the Social National Party, derived from the National Socialist Party. Its members would wear like literal brown shirts and in uniforms back in the early 2000s. He is essentially the political leader of the neo-Nazi forces, standing next to 2 US senators. So it really, I think, is a relevant issue to discuss. And there's no way to arm the Ukrainian military without arming these other forces.
So I just wanted you to take a step back. I want to talk about what happened at the Maidan, because I think that first and foremost, for example, in my conversation with Ro Khanna, there seemed to almost be a complete ignorance about America's role in 2014 that I found to be a little bit incredible. You know, he asked what proof there is of America's involvement in the coup. And I said, well, on a superficial level, the leaked Victoria Nuland tape, and he seemed to be unaware of it. I want to play you just that part of the interview and ask you to respond.
A greater Russia, of casting this as the fault of the West, as opposed to acknowledging that this is just an act of conquest. So if there were an academic in the United States, and there are, who have a different perspective, I'm all for them publishing. I'm all for robust debate, but I don't think we ought to be giving a dictator like Putin a platform to spout his message, and at the same time that he's killing women and children. That's not free speech.
So Chris Hedges is an academic. He's a professor at Princeton, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, longtime journalist at the New York Times, who had a show on RT that was canceled as a consequence of this. The record, the historical record, the archive of these shows in many cases is missing forever. And there have been journalists like Abby Martin, who was recently on Bad Faith podcast, who are quite notable for being openly antagonistic and critical of Russia and Putin in the context of the 2014 coup. Do you see a similar level of criticism of America's involvement and role?
And that can have your views heard. And it's not like we had some military involvement in trying to change the Ukrainian government, where that's what Russia is doing. But
why is the line military involvement, though, Representative? The issue is that so you're chuckling already. So this is the line that he sticks to. America had no involvement, none at all. But it gets deeper. The way that America does regime change is 99% non-military. The reality is that it's used its democracy building arms, the CIA, the State Department, to do regime change across the world, and you're very familiar with this fact. So it's not to draw false equivalencies or say that it is absolving Putin for the invasion. But the left has been trying to ring the alarm and just simply allude to the reality that Putin is responding to a number of geopolitical events, some of which were caused by the United States of America. And doing so has caused people, including Max Blumenthal, to be accused of being Putin's puppet just for speaking to the historical record.
I never would condone anyone making that accusation without hard evidence. I mean, if you're going to say that someone is Putin's puppet, you better have hard evidence that they are getting paid or influenced.
Did you feel like that was the implication of his tweet, Max?
Yeah, definitely. And it comes from my Wikipedia page, which is edited. I mean, look at who edits my Wikipedia page. Over 50% of it by one account named Philip Cross. Anyone watching this, look up who Philip Cross is. And it says that I'm a regular Sputnik RT contributor. Well, I would have no shame about being that. It just says that to poison my entire bio and present me as like a Russian agent.
And I
So
have to
that's what
apologize. I went along. I should have corrected him and
no,
said
it's
that you're
fine. I mean, it's just good to get him on the record about what he believes.
Yeah. All right. Bear with me. He's almost to the Victorian Newland part.
Influenced by Putin, and I certainly have never called anyone that, and wouldn't unless I had hard evidence of that. I think that is fear mongering that I reject. But the same thing on 2014. I mean, my understanding is that you had a leader who wanted to be tilted towards the West, and then Europe, and reconsidered it. But if you're going to say that the United States had some role that they shouldn't have, I would want to see hard evidence of exactly what they did. And I admit that I am not familiar with all of the details there, and will be open post this war right now, because I think that we shouldn't be giving Putin an excuse to justify something that is 100% morally wrong. We should have an open conversation, and I'd be open to looking at the details. But we can't just sling accusations also, or allegations, without hard evidence on that. I mean, when people say the United States role, what specifically was the United States role?
For Representative Khanna, the hard evidence that most people point to most concretely is leaked calls of Victoria Nuland actively having a conversation in which they pick Ukraine's next leader, and the person that was selected did in fact become the leader of Ukraine.
The audio clip of a woman and man said to be Nuland and Pyatt. Here's them discussing strategies to work with the three main opposition figures.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
And as a member of the, House Armed Services Committee, as someone with the foreign policy bona fides, as you do, I feel like some members of our audience are going to be a little incredulous that this aspect of the historical narrative is coming as a surprise. But perhaps they shouldn't be surprised, because this is exactly why outlets like RT are so valuable to so many Americans, because the mainstream news does not allow any of this narrative to permeate it. All right. Are you surprised by that?
Well, let me just piggyback on what you were saying about RT. I think one of the things that makes RT so valuable, aside from the fact they have people like Chris Hedges, who's doing kind of like a more slashing version of what Bill Moyers did, with just straight up Q&A with interesting people and intellectuals and so on. What makes it so valuable is that it does present Russia's point of view in news form. And that's something that Americans should have when they make up their mind, in addition to all of the other sources, the New York Times, which presents the State Department's point of view. But these people, the censors, those who want to ban RT, they think we're idiots. They think that we're just going to be drawn in and everyone's going to become like some Putinoid and join the United Russia Party and start tearing America down. They think that they really believe that RT was trying to cause a color revolution in the US by covering Black Lives Matter and covering Occupy. And yeah, it did provide a valuable service, but also I think people across the country are discerning enough to recognize RT for what it is, the same way they're able to recognize corporate media for what it is, which is why so many people, like the normies, are just turning away, and why Joe Rogan's ratings are 11 times higher than MSNBC's. It's just people actually do have agency. So that's a point on RT. That's why I think RT is valuable. I think like if you get the RT app, watch the news on the app. You can still do that, the international news, and see how it covers the war, and just, balance it with whatever else you're consuming and make up your mind for yourself. On the issue of Ukraine being the Maidan so-called revolution of dignity, having a U.S. hand behind it, I'm really glad you played that Nuland call. As we now know, Nuland controls Ukraine-Russia policy for the State Department. She's the undersecretary. So she's back in the room, Her husband is Robert Kagan, one of the arch neocons, who spelled out the plan for a project for a new American century of regime change in all countries that resist American hegemony back in the 90s. So she's basically Robert Kagan in the Biden administration. And we should really try to understand the significance of Ukraine to the US and Russia before we understand why the US, according to Victoria Nuland herself in a meeting, a Chevron shareholders meeting in 2012, I believe it was. This is on video. She said that the US had contributed $7 billion to the Ukrainian opposition since the end of the Cold War. So why did the US do that? Well, we can look at a memo by Stratfor. Stratfor is kind of like a private spying firm or private analysis firm. It's kind of like a private CIA. It's very pro-Western, pro-US. It said this in 2005, without Ukraine, Russia's political, economic, and military survivability are called into question. Without Ukraine, Russia is doomed to a painful slide into geopolitical obsolescence and ultimately, perhaps even non-existence. And that's what the US wants. It wants the balkanization and weakening of Russia.
What is the strategic significance of Ukraine?
You look at its location. For example, why did Russia annex Crimea after 2014? Number one, they had a referendum, and it's an ethnic Russian-speaking population that voted almost over 90% to join Russia rather than be part of this kind of nationalist oligarchic government in Kiev. But for the Russian security sector, it's the only warm water port that Russia has, Sevastopol. Sevastopol has been critical to Russia's security going back to the Soviet Union. One of the most ferocious battles was fought to defend Sevastopol from the advancing Germans. And it's because of that port and the access that it gives and commerce. The Black Sea, Russia needs to control the Black Sea or have channels into the Black Sea. And then there's the Sea of Azov, whose port is the city that we've been hearing so much about in the news for the past few weeks, Mariupol. Then, Ukraine is a major exporter of grain. It's kind of one of the bread baskets of Europe. So it exports to Russia and also imports from Russia. It's one of the largest traditional trading partners of Russia, including importing natural gas. So the whole, 2014 was spurred by President Viktor Yanukovych, rejecting an association agreement with the EU, which was essentially an IMF austerity program for Ukraine, to make Ukraine the poor man of Europe, which it is today, versus what Putin was offering, which was also onerous, but was much more generous and was designed to keep Ukraine neutral and favorable to Russia and to maintain this kind of security, strategic depth. And that would have allowed Ukraine to import lots of cheap natural gas for heating and be a major trading partner of Russia. And so for accepting that, the coup was launched. How was the coup launched? It was launched because the US had laid the groundwork through the National Endowment for Democracy, which is kind of an arm of the State Department, technically a nonprofit, that funds media and civil society, trains activists in social media, and helps organize these kinds of color revolutions. I'll give you one example. As soon as the youth went out into Maidan Square, this TV station just cropped up almost overnight. It's called Hromadske, Hromadske, if you want to look it up. And it was funded almost entirely by the main apparatus of regime change, National Endowment for Democracy, the Open Society Institute of George Soros, and Pierre Omidyar, who owns The Intercept, who was kind of like emerging. He wanted to be kind of a player on the world stage, and he's involved in a lot of these as well. And that station really was driving the intensity around Maidan Square, getting people out, reporting on, the police beat us and we need to show up. And, it was a modern newsroom, very sophisticated messaging. That's just one example.
So the pushback that I hear from people, even those who are broadly sympathetic to this line of argument is that
Yeah.
it was a mixed bag, that some of the protests were as a consequence of Western influence. Some of it was organic because there were mixed views about what the country should do. And that at a certain point, there were abuses by the police in the square. And so accounts of brutality, while they may have been disproportionately reported or things like that for political reasons, did in fact happen. And that an overreach on the part of the police force was a miscalculation, frankly, that really sparked off a sincere wave of protest. What do you
Yeah.
say to that?
No, and there were, the people in the square genuinely wanted to remove this government, which was another corrupt government. I mean, you saw Yanukovych had like this big collection of luxury cars. I mean, he was slimy. There's no doubt about it. That's, that is what almost all of these countries in the post-Soviet bloc were like. But Ukraine has been a catastrophe since then. And what happened on the square was that those people who wanted to remove him did not constitute a majority of Ukrainians. They were a plurality. The country was deeply divided. Yanukovych was democratically elected, and they removed an elected leader. And how did they do it? Yanukovych signed a deal to stand his Berkut down, to have the riot police who were beating protesters, but who were also being beaten by groups like the neo-Nazi C-14 Right Sector and the neo-Nazi Patriot of Ukraine. They stood down. And what happened? C-14 and the neo-Nazis took over Kiev City Hall, plastered it with swastika flags, Confederate flags, SS flags, the Wolf's Angel.
Where did they get
symbol.
a Confederate flag? They're shipping Confederate flags to Ukraine now.
You would be shocked, but all around Europe, I've seen Confederate flags. It's kind of like this weird symbol of like
lovely.
Yeah, and so they tried to storm the presidential palace and remove him by force. Every deal was violated, and the U.S. was behind this all the way. The whole West was behind it. How do we know? One example is that C-14. Okay, this is a group named after the 14 words of the dead neo-Nazi leader David Lane. And I don't know how the slogan by heart, but it's like, we will defend the future of our white children. They're the most hardcore neo-Nazis. When they were chased out of City Hall by the riot police, where did they take shelter? The Canadian embassy in Kiev. I mean, they were behind this all the way. So, and what has happened to Ukraine? It's been systematically de-developed, turned into a de facto NATO base. You have thousands of American trainers cycling through every year to train the Ukrainian military. Last December, U.S. Congress approved, and I don't know what Ro Khanna voted, like $200 million for new weapons to Ukraine. Billions of dollars of weapons have just flooded into that country. And it's had one of the largest migration outflows of any country, around the level that Venezuela has seen since it was sanctioned. And that shows you what is going on there.
So
weapons coming in, no infrastructure, no development, no education, no support for the people. That's what NATO wants.
So what do you make then of Ro Khanna being seemingly completely ignorant about all of this? And really asking me in that, I mean, you heard him, what proof is there that America had any involvement? Later on in the episode, I really press him on, I'm like, you're a lawyer, Ro Khanna, you understand what contributory negligence is. You understand that just because someone is partly responsible for something doesn't mean the other person is absolved of their responsibility. Are you really unwilling to say that America played any role in this conflict? And he said, no, America is 100% right. 100% in the right in this, and Russia is 100% wrong. This is unequivocal. This is a just war.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with where the Democratic Party is today, that it really truly is the party of war. You don't hear any criticism of this, maybe some half-hearted criticism from Ilhan Omar, and she stands almost alone, maybe Cori Bush. But there's the whole America First faction of the Republicans is standing up against this. And they're saying, we need to take care of our people here. So why are we imposing sanctions that are going to drive inflation? I mean, I interviewed Representative Thomas Massey that same day, and he was basically saying there's no point in a government unless it's going to look out for its own citizens. And here you have the president saying that he is going to make life economically more miserable for Americans after 2 years of the controlled demolition of the economy under COVID. in order to show resolve to Putin and to show moral clarity, which is real neocon thinking. So the Democratic Party is really possibly the most dangerous party on the planet. And that's partly because it's filled with people like Ro Khanna or AOC who apply this kind of multicultural pro-peace veneer atop the war party, whereas we know what the Republicans really traditionally have been. And there's a uniparty in Washington that controls all of the main institutions. And so we shouldn't even necessarily talk about the Democratic Party. We should talk about the uniparty, because Mitt Romney and Ro Khanna sound exactly the same when it comes to this issue, but Mitt Romney is a career Republican.
Well, what do you think about Ro Khanna's? I mean, he kind of deflected to this idea that he's been good on other foreign policy issues, that he's been championing the, advocacy for Yemen, and withdrawing our from our relationship with Saudi Arabia and all of these kinds of things. And I will give him credit for that. But what do you think the distinction is between those instances where he's been a real leader on a more progressive foreign policy platform and what's going on now in Ukraine?
No, that stuff is easy. I mean, even the neocons have gone after Saudi Arabia.
Don't do it, though. I mean, so many people say nothing about Yemen. Like, I mean, he is, I think, fairly. He and Bernie are on the left flank of some of these issues, and I'm curious what you think make the differences.
Yeah, the Bernie Mike Lee initiative to start, it was just a resolution to defund the war in Yemen. That was nice. It was a nice idea. And then, when the Khashoggi killing took place, which is just shrouded in intrigue, it became much more easy in Washington to hate Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is seen as kind of a Saddam Hussein by the CIA. U.S. intelligence does not trust him. They also see him as a little too big for his britches. And he's showing it now. He's not taking Biden's phone calls. He's not opening up the taps. And the UAE as well. They're kind of shafting Biden. And that was always the fear. So I think the Saudi issue is much easier. Where we need leadership is on the hardest issue. And the hardest issue is starting diplomacy with Russia and avoiding these wars. What Russiagate was about to me, besides being an avenue for Clintonite dead enders to make excuses for one of the worst run campaigns in history, and for fanatical blue anon liberals to try to embarrass Trump, it was about criminalizing diplomacy, and it succeeded. And that's why you saw people like John Brennan, the former CIA director, who are the ultimate hardliners when it comes to Russia, World War III advocates, kind of working behind the scenes, pulling strings behind the scenes around Russiagate. Because any act of diplomacy that Trump committed, whether he would meet with Putin one-on-one, they would say there was no translator there. He was cutting secret deals to sell out America. He had his own, national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, leaking that he sent him notes urging him not to congratulate Putin after Putin won his election. Just everyone was trying to embarrass Trump anytime he tried to make any move to do diplomacy with Putin and keep relations at least at a level where the US and Russia could cooperate on security, for example, in Syria against ISIS. And now it's at a point of complete and total breakdown between two nuclear powers, and Ukraine is really caught in the middle. This war is not about the Ukrainian people. This war is about NATO versus Russia, and NATO is the US's cat's paw to screw over, to keep Europe weak, and to commit regime change in Russia, as Biden just revealed in Poland. He let the cat out of the bag, that the whole agenda here is about regime change in Moscow. The U.S.
today that Putin must not stay in power.
Yes, yeah, this man must not stay in power. We've heard, Canadian officials say we must strangle Russia. We've heard the same thing from other leaders of NATO countries. So this is what they want: a weak, demented leader like Boris Yeltsin, who will preside over the Balkanization of Russia. And that's not going to happen. There's a new poll by a non-governmental firm called Levada in Russia that shows Putin's approval rating is shot up to 81%. Just like 2 months ago, it was in the low 60s. It was actually declining.
I saw that. And the ruble's back.
The ruble is at 85 to the dollar. Biden claimed falsely in his speech in Poland that the ruble was at 200 to the dollar. And it really felt like he had written that speech had been prepared for him 2 weeks before. So this is not really working out for the U.S., but what they want to do, and what Ro Khanna is going along with, and other progressives. I mean, we haven't heard what AOC has to say about this, but she stood up and cheered with her Ukraine pin on for Biden's State of the Union, which was, an address that reminded me a lot of Bush's post 9/11 address, calling for a long war. What they want is to extend this war as long as possible and bleed Russia, which means fighting this war down to the last Ukrainian. And the Ukrainian military, Americans aren't being told the truth about what's happening there. In the East, they're getting slaughtered, and a lot of young men are being killed unnecessarily. They're surrounded by the Russian military in the East. And all we hear about are these little tiny battles in towns where the Ukrainian military might have performed better in the outskirts of Kiev.
What I'm noticing is a framing that says if it's harder for Russia than people thought it was going to be, people keep, even if it's true that the perception was that Russia was going to have an easier time taking these parts of Ukraine, that doesn't mean that Ukraine is not still suffering enormously. And people, I feel like, are conflating the idea of Russia having a little struggle bus with Ukraine being like her, killing the game,
Yeah.
really doing well. And so this came up in the interview, because this is a question I've pressed with a couple of folks who've come on the podcast over the last month. How can you justify, why is there this presumption that the humane thing to do is to provide weapons, even separate and apart from this question of who the weapons are actually going to and whether you're concerned about neo-Nazi groups? How are you confident that giving weapons is basically improving Ukraine's negotiating abilities and making it more likely that war is going to end sooner, versus prolonging the war ultimately on the off chance, hoping that ultimately you will wear Russia down enough that you can achieve your negotiating goals? If everyone knows what the negotiating goals are a priori, that's this territory or that is going to be have to given away. Why is it that we're treating these human beings as cannon fodder and also dressing it up as a humanitarian approach?
Yeah. I mean, this is being driven by hardliners in the State Department like Tony Blinken. He has had no meetings, as far as I know, with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. And what do we care? Seriously, what do we care as Americans if Ukraine is neutral or not? Why do we need Ukraine to be this NATO protectorate that is armed to the teeth while its citizens are being kept poor, the poorest country in Europe? Why does that matter to us? And what is the moral case for supporting a post-Maidan Ukraine with missiles pointed at Russia that is in this constant trench war in the East? What is the moral case?
Well, what Rose said repeatedly was that, it's a sovereign nation. It's been invaded. People have a right to their sovereignty, and therefore it is our requirement in pursuit of justice to enable them to defend their homeland in this just war.
Right. And as we've seen, Vladimir Zelensky, who is like, the heartthrob of every like liberal Maddow watcher, he's like,
my calves are cramping.
Yeah. He banned every left-wing party in the past 2 weeks. He banned 13 parties. They were Eurosceptic parties, but they're every party he didn't like, parties that represented the ethnic Russian population. Before that, he had banned all the opposition TV stations before the war with the open encouragement of the State Department. He had jailed Medvedchuk, who was the leader of the main opposition party, for life, because he represented the ethnic Russian population, had a good relationship with Putin, but he could have been a bridge to that population. He jailed him after neo-Nazis attacked his house. He has honored the leader of the Azov battalion in Mariupol, Denis Prokopenko, with the Hero of Ukraine award in the past weeks. This is a guy who's responsible for heinous atrocities and the regime of terror that Azov has waged in that city. The country is not a democracy in any way, shape, or form. Maybe, so they do share some values with us. It is an oligarchy. And Zelensky himself is controlled by a guy named Igor Kolomoisky, one of the most corrupt men on the planet, one of the wealthiest men in Ukraine, who in the Pandora Papers was seen paying Zelensky and his inner circle tens of millions of dollars through a series of offshore shell companies for video productions and everything else. And Zelensky's running around the globe begging for World War III. He is the world's top lobbyist for World War III right now. And I've just been told that he was nominated for a Nobel Prize, which would be appropriate after Obama got one.
Right. I want to come back to this, to that in a second. I want to take a couple of these questions, though, that have been queuing up. Carpe Diem says, will Khanna prioritize Haitian, Salvadorian, Guatemalan, Honduran refugees getting residency before Ukrainian refugees? We're already seeing that. I just saw an article about 100,000 asylum seekers being sent back at the same time that there's this humanitarian response for Ukrainians. Bobby Johnson says, wonder what the long game is with Ro Khanna. Surely he doesn't think he can win anything nationally. Are Dems grooming him to be the new Liz Warren spoiler candidate? Now, I asked him about his presidential ambitions at the end of this in this episode. I asked him about 2024. He said, absolutely not. I said, but what about 2028? And he said, well, who knows what the future is going to be? I asked him if he thought Joe Biden was going to have a progressive challenger. And his response was, he wasn't sure, but maybe not. I said, well, but that he was going to support Joe Biden. I said, well, if Joe Biden had a progressive challenger in 2024 and you're a progressive, why wouldn't you support the progressive challenger? And he basically said he wouldn't want to see Biden weaken. That presumably he doesn't think the progressive challenger would be successful. And he evoked the threat of Trump going up against a weakened Biden. So there's that. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that this that the shift that you've observed with Ro Khanna has had to do with new staff, or does it have to do with, do you think, potentially presidential ambitions, or do you think the new staff is because of these longer term political ambitions?
I mean, let's be real. In U.S. politics, in the heart of the empire, if he had responded to me, and he obviously wasn't prepared for the interview, so we got like kind of the real Ro, or what he wanted to project. If he had said it's disgusting that the U.S. is sending weapons to literal neo-Nazis, that would have been used against him by his opponents. And they would have said, Pete Buttigieg or whoever would have been up there, Ro Khanna doesn't think we should have armed the Ukrainian people to defend against Vladimir Satan.
I have a hard time believing if he literally said, I don't think weapons should go to neo-Nazis. I think that's hard for anybody to argue. No, I do think neo-Nazis should get weapons. And moreover, in Ro's defense, in this interview, he did point to the legislation that says you can't fund the neo-Nazis as a response to me about why I shouldn't be concerned, basically, about neo-Nazis getting the weapons that he advocates for sending to Ukraine.
I remember Jeb Bush in the 2016 debate saying Trump doesn't want to give weapons to our Islamist friends in Syria who are on our team. So, I mean,
maybe I'm insufficiently cynical. I thought maybe there was a line drawn at Nazis, but maybe you're right, because the Nazis are getting redefined per. Do you see that Candace Owens dunk? I hate to have to.
I mean, it's
Candace Owens dunk, but she beat the New York Times on that one. Did you see that?
I didn't, but she's been, I've been, forced to agree with her a few times.
Yeah, look, basically the New York Times wrote her an email asking.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Why she characterized, these Ukrainian neo-Nazis as neo-Nazis, and she responded with a bunch of quotes from New York Times articles from yesteryear, where the New York Times was characterizing them as neo-Nazis and said, when did you redefine this? So that's where we are. Lucille Bullocks says, let's get past this war before we don't learn anything and do it all over again somewhere else in a few years. Yeah, she's evoking the fact that Ro Khanna, when I asked him these kind of philosophical questions about, okay, but how do you decide if it's a just war? How do you decide if it's appropriate for the U.S. to play the world's policeman, even if you do think it's a just war? Why do you think that it's us that should be providing arms when, to your point, Max, there's so many people struggling here domestically? Why should we be spending this money, adding $30 billion to the defense budget, all this stuff? And he says, those are good questions, but we'll think about them after Ukraine. What do you say to that?
Well, after Ukraine, it's too late. I mean, you can see the Washington Post clamoring for $1 trillion defense. I wouldn't even call it a war budget. Biden is proposing a record war budget. And this is military Keynesianism. At least half the money goes to private contractors, which are transforming the city I grew up in Washington. And you can just see it with the amount of kind of wealth and gentrification taking here. That's all contractor money. as well as all the mansions going up in Northern Virginia. So this is just Biden kind of, it's kind of like a stimulus for the economy with a lot of carnage on the frontiers of Russia, just outside of our view. That's what this is all about. So you even have defense contractors and their lobbyists commenting to The Hill and other publications that are, a rising tide is lifting all boats, and it's the rising tide of bloodshed in Ukraine. This all goes back to the 2018 Trump national security doctrine announced by Jim Mattis in 2018, where ISIS and the war on terror were not mentioned once. It was all about great power competition with China, because that is, and Russia, because that is how the national security state, not just referring to the Pentagon and the military industrial complex, but to the entire national security apparatus down to the FBI and US intelligence, the NSA. That's how they're going to justify all of their bureaucratic priorities to keep expanding and then getting their tentacles deeper into the political system. So we're really living in kind of a military intelligence oligarchy right now. And these budgets just make it much, much harder for anyone who's progressive to imagine anything remotely democratic in our future. I mean, I don't even really see what the point of a Ro Khanna in the Democratic Party is, unless he's going to just be cover for this entire kind of national security state.
Let me ask you this question that's on the screen right now. We've gotten some pushback. Ramil77 says there's so much lying by omission here. For example, the so-called election in Crimea was a sham. I hope you go back and verify all he's saying, Bree. What do you say to that?
Well, it was such a sham that when Crimean authorities and Russia invited OECD and EU observers in, they refused because they were determined to call it a sham. And I would challenge Ramil77 to go to Sebastopol or Crimea and ask people what they actually think and whether they wanted to be part of a Ukrainian state after 2014 that removed Russian as an official language, and then kind of waged a political war on the Russian Orthodox Church that ethnic Russians worshipped in, and openly demonized them as termites. A fifth column, Vladimir Zelensky even himself said in August 2021 that those ethnic Russians in the Donbass who don't want to wave the Ukrainian flag should self-deport to Russia. They're not a part of Ukraine, and they should just, and that the patriotic Ukrainians should just hold on because we're going to retake that whole area militarily and deoccupy it, meaning remove all the ethnic Russians. I've had the chance to talk to people from Crimea, including political leadership there, and the sad thing is they welcomed Zelensky in 2019. They saw him as their only hope because he campaigned on peace with Ukraine's ethnic Russian population. And now here he is as the war president. And I think most of those people are pretty happy with their decision to not be a part of that state.
I'm getting kind of Abiy Ethiopia vibes. That's probably an overstatement, but between the Nobel Peace Prize and the idea of this kind of unifying candidate from crossing ethnic lines and from ethnic groups that aren't historically represented, it's an interesting parallel for someone who's a lot more than I do.
You just dropped a heavyweight right there. I mean, that's a whole nother issue, but we've done some coverage of Ethiopia at the Gray Zone. We definitely are presenting a different view than you're getting in the mainstream, but
I'd be interested to have some people on, because I did an episode last summer and it was very difficult to get people on, and it was very difficult to get people with different political perspectives on with each other. And this was another one of the situations where it's like, I don't know, I don't have a bird in this fight. Let's just hear out the arguments. But it was difficult to get that kind of a situation going. And people then were upset with the guests that I did have because there was only one view. And I said, well, great. Well, tell me who else should come on, and they can come on. So we definitely need to return to that issue. I want to shout out, I'm a Phil American. This episode is the dream team. Thank you so much for a great show, Bree and Max. You're both real legitimate role models for the left. Thank you for that. Max, for people who aren't familiar with you and your background in the Gray Zone, can you tell folks a little bit about how you came to this work and where to find more of your work?
Well, I've been doing journalism for like 20 years. I started getting into it after 9/11 and just that whole experience, I actually hadn't planned on a career in journalism, but that experience kind of galvanized my interest in, especially.
What were you planning on doing?
I really wasn't quite sure at that point, but I didn't want to, my parents were in Washington and in politics. So I was like, I'm going to try to do something different. I was in LA. I was teaching and like, I was substitute teaching and just, I was in my early 20s and I was out of college and I started writing for salon.com about, the Bush administration, the Christian right, the neocons. And it was at a time when salon.com had real influence. It was the birth of online media. And I realized, I could have a real impact here doing journalism. I started covering the Christian right because I saw them as the power behind the throne of the Bush administration. Then that became kind of like easy in some ways. The Obama era took off. The Obama era was, there was the dawn of the Obama era after his election, and Israel was waging a brutal assault on the Gaza Strip. I'm Jewish. I grew up in Washington where, it's a very Zionist environment. Although my family's not Zionist, it was all around. I went to Hebrew school. I went on the Birthright Israel free trip to Israel. So I'd been through the propaganda, and I'd also watched closely the Second Intifada, the Israeli assault on southern Lebanon. And I was growing disenchanted with Zionism. And I decided to, after a successful book on the Christian right and the Bush administration, to put my energy into a book on the real Israel that Americans didn't know. 5 years later, Goliath came out. It caused a huge controversy, but I think, it kind of broke through the wall of propaganda and misinformation on Israel. And, I was just living there in central Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the West Bank and really chronicling my experience and the journalism I was doing. I would go up in the Israeli Knesset and interview members, including especially the right-wing members who are the future of Israeli politics. And I put it all there in a book. And that kind of like changed my career trajectory. Like before then, I'd been able to get a job at the Daily Beast. The Nation was like, please write more for us. It became harder and harder to find venues to write for. And I started to see the world differently because Palestine became my lens for seeing the world, and specifically, occupied West Bank and besieged Gaza. And
go ahead.
So it took me into like full on, anti-imperialist alternative media. And as I saw one progressive website after another kind of collapse around me and become harder and harder to write for, especially around issues like Syria, I started my own website. I just like launched a WordPress platform, and it sort of took on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's remarkable how successful some of these independent media outlets are able to be precisely because of how limited the mainstream is. And you would think that on a pure capitalism basis, some of them would say, okay, let's have a leftist on. Okay, let's have a leftist contributor. Just enough to get the clicks and earn the money without actually toppling the status quo. And they seem to be disinclined even toward that. And as what you're saying is that it's difficult to get any job in the business anymore once you articulate a certain political position. And that's terrifying. I mean, I barely said or did anything, but the campaign ended and you had Tiffany Cross and all of these MSNBC pundits tweeting, "You'll never work in this town again." Who am I? I'm not even from here.
No, I remember that. And what's that MSNBC guy, basically
Jason Johnson.
Yeah. He like tried to take away your Black membership card or something. Like,
you know how it is.
Just, people see through this, and you have more influence than an MSNBC contributor. I mean, we're in a different era now. And I kind of the Gray Zone started sort of as this cutout or project inside Alternet. I'd always had good relationships with their leadership, and they let me do my thing there. But then Alternet collapsed. I don't want to get into the whole situation there, but it definitely deserves a discussion at some point. It collapsed. I was writing for Truth Dig too, Bob Shear's publication. That collapsed. The Nation became off limits because they became horrible on foreign policy. I mean, there really became no place to write for it. And I feel like
that too. Like, what happens when in a magazine like that shifts? What do you think? Is it like one editor leaving? Do you think it's a top-down decision that's higher than editorial?
It's all about personnel, and I'll give you some detail there. I'm happy to do it, but just to finish off my point, it was 2017. It was the birth of Russiagate, like complete hysteria in Washington over Trump, and across the progressive, what used to be known as the blogosphere. Everyone had Trump derangement syndrome. So when I started this site, it was also the dawn of this kind of new media where you can monetize yourself. We're talking on StreamYard. These powerful new technologies came into play. Everyone has to do live streams now. And it's, people want live streams. They don't want some phony, drone, blue anon drone in an air conditioned studio. This is what they want. So it sort of took off. And I think you got in a similar way. Back to the
no alternative. There was
right.
no alternative really to self-employed.
Right. There is no alternative. And so I think that's why we're seeing so much censorship of YouTube and the platforms that we're on. And then you have like the birth of other sites like Rumble, YouTube competitors. So far, I think it's in some ways it's a golden age for alternative media for those of us who jumped ship from the old alternative media, which just became ossified and just irrelevant. But and I think I would call the Nation part of that. The Nation was led by Katrina vanden Heuvel, who's a friend and someone I think is, one of the few courageous progressives left, particularly of her generation. She was married to Stephen Cohen, who is probably the only real Russia expert who was able to get on cable news. He taught at Princeton, NYU, and he became one of the most hated men among the foreign policy establishment during Russiagate because he was calling it what it was, a war on diplomacy. He believed in the US having a good relationship, like at least a relationship with Russia. He lived in Moscow. He spent years and years working on his dissertation there. He spoke Russian. He was personally friendly with Gorbachev. He knows people around Putin. So he was a genuine expert. And so Katrina was seen as a proxy for him, and all the writers that they would have present like an actual realist view of Russia, like James Carden, who used to work in the State Department. They became targeted by people like Katha Pollitt, who are the hysterical Blue Anon Russiagate fanatics, Joan Walsh, these Clintonite characters. They were inventing phony allegations of like sexual harassment against Matt Taibbi because he was opposing Russiagate. It was horrible what they were doing. And they would just personally attack and smear Katrina on Facebook, as well as Stephen Cohen. And that whole toxic atmosphere that they created in the Nation, I think effectively and ultimately purged it of any, skeptics of U.S. foreign policy. Now it's run by this guy, Didi Gutenplan, who's like, I don't know where he came from, but he's like completely on board with the, toxic Blue Anon fashion. And it's really sad to see. It really does come down to personnel, and it requires someone just being a leader and being ruthless with people who try to poison the institution and having a real vision. So me having the Gray Zone has allowed me to kind of impose my vision on the ecosystem of alternative media, and people have responded by being supportive, just like they are obviously supporting you.
And I'm grateful for it. I'm going to read some of these comments. This might have been too far past, so don't feel I have to get back into this if it's the moment's gone. Bobby Johnson asks, what is the political orientation of the Eastern Republics? David, Max is one of the best. Thank you, David. David, again, the USA has been occupying Ukraine since 2014. Putin is freeing Ukraine from the USA. What do you say to that kind of? Because this is the kind of take that gets some folks in trouble. This is the kind of take that gets, Ro feeling justified in saying that this is, Putin apologia that the left is doing. And I think that David is being a little like tongue in cheek here. But what is your response to a criticism that might say, okay, it's not helpful to the left that wants people to rightly pay attention to the U.S.'s entanglements here, to kind of go farther in the opposite direction and say, well, Putin is actually the liberatory force here?
Well, it's my job as an American to make critical observations about what's happening in Ukraine. But there are also objective realities that can't be denied, which is that pretty much everyone west of the Dnipro River does not see Putin as a liberator. They see him as an oppressor or an occupier. And then you have the people in Donetsk and Lugansk, relating to the previous question, who do see this as a liberatory military operation. We just need to take that into account. What I say doesn't matter. I don't live there. I live here, and there's no, moral case for the U.S. to be supporting Ukraine with weapons or to be involved at such a level. It's about regime change. And as an anti-war journalist, my job is to focus on Washington. That's why I'm here. So to the previous question, there is a lot of nostalgia in Lugansk and Donetsk for the Soviet Union. You've actually seen the Donetsk forces go into the field with Soviet flags on their tanks. They are the leading parties in those republics identify as socialist, but their kind of socialism would be very different from the kind of socialism that's taken root in the West. And it does relate to the future of Ukraine and what kind of situation Russia will try to consolidate. Will Russia try to set up some kind of Russian-backed Ukrainian capital in one of those republics, or maybe it'll be a city like Kharkiv, or in Russian Kharkov, which has had a large ethnic Russian population, but they're not as their mentality is very different, and their leadership was purged violently by forces, including the Azov Battalion after 2014. So they may not even have as much control over the city. But a lot of people have gone from the West as foreign fighters or in solidarity missions to the Donbass republics, who identify as socialist or communist. And, obviously you see a lot of foreign fighters who are just army veterans from the US and Europe, or mercenaries, or just straight up sociopaths going to fight on the Ukrainian side now.
I want to just read the next comment on the screen, but first I want to do my due diligence as a podcast host and say 2,000 people in the thing, and I have to tell you to like the video, because if you want more people to hear what Max is saying and to hear this perspective, you got to help us beat the algorithm. So make sure that there are as many likes on the video as there are people in the chat. Basically, I see you guys over there on Colin. I'm going to get to you in a second. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I see substantive comments all the time. This is the best channel. Oh my God, I can't believe this channel is chronically undersubscribed. I mean, that's really sweet of you to say, but also you can help by liking and sharing it. And also you should obviously go and like and share and follow and subscribe to the Gray Zone as well. Long story short, on the screen says, Max, is there any substance to Hunter being connected to certain type of lab in Ukraine?
Well, I don't want to get anything wrong, but there is it does seem to be that the answer is yes. We know through his laptop that Hunter Biden was affiliated with a firm called Rosemont Seneca Technology Partners, and they invested through that firm $500,000 in something called Metabiota, which was a Pentagon contractor overseeing some of these biolabs in Ukraine. And some of the emails that came out through the laptop showed that Hunter raised millions for Metabiota. This is kind of like Metabiota. You could compare it to Eco Health Alliance, which was the NGO that funded a lot of the research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has become the main source of intrigue around the origins of COVID-19. And Eco Health Alliance was itself sponsored. The majority of its research was sponsored by the Pentagon's DARPA research arm and USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And a lot of that research, in my opinion, qualified as gain of function research, which is just really dangerous. I don't know exactly. I haven't done a deep dive into what might have been taking place in these biolabs in Ukraine. They were funded. Metabiota was like the channel for funding them through the Pentagon Biological Threat Reduction Agency. And so the overt or explicit aim, according to the Pentagon and all of these other groups, was to actually hold dangerous pathogens that had been created during the days of the Soviet Union and prevent them from doing harm. But why do you need to hold them? And why did Victoria Nuland say in her testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, which kind of like lifted the mask or blew the cover off this, why did she say that the US was working to secure these labs? And why was it that the day after some of these labs were actually taken by Russian forces, that the US, Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US UN ambassador, why did they start warning of a Russian chemical attack the day after? Why did they start saying that? So these are questions that I think I don't want to offer a definitive answer to, but we do need to raise them.
Yeah, it's definitely worth doing an episode about it. I have not personally been following that very closely, but
I mean, it takes a lot of mental energy, and
people don't understand. There's too many stories, guys. It's hard. there's too much news, and then you got to do a whole episode on the slap. It's just a lot. I want to read.
Have you done anything on that yet?
The night of the slap, I did an impromptu call-in at like midnight about it. And can I tell you, it was my most well-attended call-in to date. But shame on all of you with your period interest in this pop culture crap. But we had fun. It was a good time.
Let me just ask you. I saw a poll and it showed that the less education people had, the more supportive, the more consternation they showed to Will Smith. I guess,
interesting.
I mean, I hate the word woke, but like the woke mentality does pervade people with advanced degrees most disproportionately. And I think they're the ones who are most supportive of Will Smith in my experience. But
well, even framing it that way is I think part of the problem, right? I think that nobody thinks the ideal outcome is Will Smith getting up on stage and slapping him. But at the risk of doing the thing where you make the slap a Ukraine-Russia analogy, I think we can acknowledge that both parties are wrong. Like, you shouldn't slap someone. Also, maybe you shouldn't make provocative jokes about your friend's wife with alopecia's hair, especially given that you made a terrible movie about black hair in 2014 or so, in which you showed that you like have a very complicated, and I would argue disrespectful relationship with black women, but that's a whole other podcast and a whole other thing. So it's like, the problem is for me that so many of the responses have acted like what Will Smith did was like a capital crime. And it's lost all sense of proportionality. So while the night of
arrest him.
Exactly. The night of, you're like, okay, you should have done that. That was awkward and cringe and bad, and you shouldn't hit people. 2 days later, it's like, oh, Will Smith is a pox on Black America and he represents. It's like, no. First of all, he's allowed to be a human being who makes a mistake. And you making it a referendum on all Black people is a you problem, not a Black people problem. And second of all, like, he slapped the guy. He's huge. You could have decked him. He could have hurt him. He could have done all kinds of things. It's not an absolution, but let's just like keep it in context. The most remarkable thing about it was that it happened at the Oscars. And I think what the dividing line is about how whether people come down one way or the other is how much they respect the Oscars as like hallowed ground. And that's, if you don't give a shit about rich people and what they do, then it's just hilarious. Oh, isn't this like a weird kind of hilarious thing that happened? If you're like, oh my God, propriety. I can't believe that someone would do this. They had gowns on. Like, how dare he? Like, then you're going to have issues. And as someone who just doesn't care that much about the Oscars, I was mostly just kind of amused and ready to move on.
Yeah, it's kind of like MMA of rich liberal freaks.
Right.
So
no winners here. It's like victimless crime, really.
I mean, he kind of gave the people what they wanted, because up until that point, it was kind of like whatever.
Yeah. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to read just a couple of these because I'm getting a little behind with these comments. Thank you, Brian Max. I'm not sure what we'd do without you providing voices of sanity. Thank you. Analytical Failure says Ro didn't care about America when Azerbaijan aggressor against them. little syntax. Killing women and children. How is that different than Russia? Geopolitics. Yeah, the women and children thing was a bit of a trigger, I think, for everyone.
Well, I don't know where Ro Khanna's district is, but California does have a lot of Armenians. Adam Schiff's district has a lot of them because he represents Glendale outside LA. And Armenians faced a pretty aggressive military offensive by Azerbaijan, backed by the NATO member Turkey in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, I believe. And they're, on the brink of another assault. And U.S. media was not really interested in the women and children being killed there. And they, back in 1994, Armenians suffered just horrible atrocities there as well. So it is a good point. It's like it would be called whataboutism by, some people, but it really is relevant. That
It's a search for some kind of moral consistency. That's all I'm
Yeah.
ever asking you to. Even when I did my first episode with Matt Dust, that a lot of people were upset about, I was like, I'm fully admitting to not knowing the facts as well as many, many other people like yourself, Max. But we should be able to come to certain kind of principled stances in the abstract, even regardless of what's happening specifically in this instance. I need people to be able to articulate when what is required for us to say there is a moral case to intervening at all and doing it militaristically in particular. And this brings us to this next question that's on the screen, which is relevant. This guy says, psychotic guy argues, there is a moral argument for supporting Ukraine, defending innocent people. Even if regime change is part of the agenda, that's still a moral argument. What do you say to that?
Well, that's just propagandistic language where supporting Ukraine is not not an actual concrete action that is being taken. And innocent people are not being defended. And innocent people are not necessarily the target of this military offensive. The Ukrainian military is the target, and the Ukrainian military is far from innocent. It is as criminal as any military on that battlefield for what it has been doing in the Donbass for the last 8 years and what it represents, which is simply an arm of US empire. So that really upends the moral case. Supporting Ukraine, what does supporting Ukraine mean? Supporting Ukraine to me means it could mean providing it with support for infrastructure, providing it with support for trade, education. But the support for Ukraine that we're talking about here and what this questioner is clearly referring to is military support, more weapons on the battlefield to produce more migrants and more misery in a losing fight against a superior military on behalf of a completely cynical empire that wants to fight this war down to the last Ukrainian. And my initial point about the moral case was, is there a moral case for supporting a state that is an oligarchy that is deeply anti-democratic towards its citizens who are not on board with the nationalist flavor of the government and which has incorporated neo-Nazis into its National Guard? Is there a moral case for supporting that country? The way that, many progressive Americans think there's a moral case for supporting Cuba against the blockade because of their belief in Cuban socialism and what it represents for its own citizens. Is there a moral case, similar moral case for Ukraine? There is not. Those who actually really saw a moral case for defending Ukraine and going over there and working with their armed forces before this took place, before this was a story, many of them were actually American neo-Nazis. Members of the Rise Above movement from Huntington Beach, California, went to train with the Azov battalion in Kiev and actually were indicted when they came back. And the FBI said they went to train with a neo-Nazi group incorporated into the Ukrainian military and its political wing, the National Corps, which was sponsored by the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. So you had so many neo-Nazi criminals and like killers, like Craig Lang went as a foreign fighter. This like convicted murderer or wanted murderer went to fight with the Ukrainian military years ago. And now just everybody's going out there, just like guys who want adventure, backpackers. Like they think it's like going to Burning Man or something. And they're coming back with their tails between their legs because they never thought they would see real combat.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a couple of the stories, or one guy in particular who he seemed to be kind of a good faith actor, but he said it was just so bleak and so terrible that he had all these regrets.
Can I just tell you, we have a story up at the Gray Zone. Alex Rubinstein, one of our writers, interviewed a foreign fighter who went to Ukraine. His name was Henry Hoft. He's of Ukrainian heritage. He really was upset seeing the Russian military's attacks on civilians or seeing civilians suffering. And he went over there and he issued a message saying when he got there, he signed up with the Georgian Legion. These are not like the most savory characters. He said they're threatening to shoot us in the back if we refuse orders to go forward, but they're not giving us any weapons. We are being sent on a suicide mission. Do not come here. And he escaped with his life. He barely escaped.
Yeah.
And now he has been demonized by the Ukrainian government as a Russian agent. They called him a Russian puppet on their official Twitter account. And he has been attacked in corporate media, the Rolling Stone, Vice. They're all smearing him because he's upsetting the way that the Western media wants to portray this as like Ukrainian military actually winning.
All right. For people just tuning in, we're here with Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone. He stole what was going to be the name of my MSNBC show. Leaf Nobody says, thank you so much for having Max on. Thank you. Tom Bear says, U.S. has been in Ukraine stealing with both hands for years. I guess for the ruling class. Thankful for both of you for having this conversation. Thank you, Tom. Catching up with these comments. Theodore Henderson just gave a super sticker. Thank you for that, Theodore Henderson. David again. The U.S. has been occupying Ukraine. Didn't we already read this? Since 2014, when the USA overthrew the Democratic.
Yeah, we read that.
I think you put that in there twice. Thank you for the donation. Jonathan Flanders, was the Normandy invasion a violation of French sovereignty?
Jonathan Flanders is a great anti-war activist from upstate New York. Shout out to if that's the guy. I think that
I love that. You guys are colleagues in the chat.
Yeah, that's John.
Broughton B NY, or Broughton, I don't know if that's supposed to be NY at the end. Why does Max not think the US should help the Ukrainians with weapons? Succinctly, what's your direct response to that?
The US has been helping Ukraine with weapons, and that's why this war is taking place. Why the US has been helping Ukraine with weapons because it seeks regime change in Moscow and it seeks the Balkanization of Russia. Ukraine is,
Counterpoint. Here's the argument that Ro and some others would make. I believe. I don't mean to misrepresent Ro. Obviously, go listen to the episode. But I think that he would say, well, we're in this now. We can't simply withdraw. It's kind of that Afghanistan argument. We've induced reliance interest. Maybe the America shouldn't be the policeman of the world, but we have expanded our military budgets. They don't have any military budgets. They have social safety nets instead. And we can't just unilaterally give up now without like slowly withdrawing our support here. And if we weren't providing weapons to the Ukrainians, they would all just be slaughtered and the blood would be on our hands. What do you say to that?
Well, it's just like Syria. Once the US stopped arming the so-called rebels, who are actually very similar to the neo-Nazis of Ukraine, and their extremism, their cynicism, their mercenary tendencies. Once that stopped, and actually after Russia intervened because the US was arming Al-Qaeda affiliated elements in a coalition called Jaish al-Fatah, which was advancing on the Alawite heartland in the West to commit genocide against an ethnic minority in Syria. Once that took place, the war ended, the civil war ended, and now Syria is able to attempt to rebuild, but now it's under brutal US sanctions. The same way Afghanistan is. What's different from Afghanistan in these countries is that Afghanistan was a US occupation that turned into just a semi-permanent military presence, which meant that the US had bases around the country. It was propping up a government in Kabul. Ukraine and Syria are proxy wars. They're technically, officially are no US troops, although we know they're US advisors on the ground in Ukraine, intelligence. And so it's a very different situation. Pulling out simply means negotiating, stop sending the weapons, then Ukraine becomes neutral. The war ends.
Does it though? Because some people would say that Russia is going to keep going and just conquer Ukraine? Do you think that's not the goal?
That's simply impossible. It would have no strategic value for Russia to conquer Lviv or Kiev for that matter. And militarily, it would be become a quagmire. And the U.S.
Subscribe to the idea that it wants Ukraine as a buffer state. It doesn't want to be toe-to-toe with any NATO countries, and its objective was never more than to go beyond basically the Donbass region.
That's what we're seeing, and what is taking place around Kiev and Odessa, where the Russian Navy is kind of active and threatening an amphibious assault, is sort of like a feint and a means of pinning down Ukrainian forces so they are unable to reinforce the east. And we saw
saying that the reason that they stopped from going farther was because we armed Ukraine, and because they were able to effectively push back, and because it was harder than they thought it was going to be. They've reoriented and reframed their goals to be more limited. I mean, what do you say about that? Is there evidence for that?
It doesn't matter. Russia has put its conditions out publicly, and what it seeks primarily is recognition from Ukraine of Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk as independent, and Crimea as annexed, officially part of Russia, and for the war in the east to end. Those are the main positions. And then a neutral Ukraine. Whether Russia takes Kiev or not, they will still likely get some version of that at the negotiating table. The Ukrainian military strategy, by the way, is based on the USSR's strategy. It's called fortress cities, to defend against a NATO onslaught. And the idea was to reinforce your cities and prepare for urban warfare, to slow NATO up so that the Soviet Union could call up reinforcements and begin to, push back. And so the Russian security apparatus, its military, knew Ukraine was enacting this strategy from the beginning. It's been preparing this war possibly for 8 years. So I don't think there was ever any plan to go into Kiev, and that would only happen in some kind of desperate or unusual situation, and it would be a disaster.
But I'm just curious how we know that, because there are people, and I don't know anything, right? I'm just asking questions. But there are people who say they would not have been making these particular demands, these more limited demands than, I want the whole hog, but for their military failures. And they see these incursions, these efforts to take Kiev or whatever it is, as the failure is evidence that we were right, that America was right to have provided the weapons and allowed the pushback. I mean, what do we know? What is the evidence that militates one way or the other?
I think those who say that are projecting the American military experience onto Russia's operational plan, and they're conflating tactical failures that Russia displayed, particularly in the first week of the war, with strategic failures. The US Americans think that Russia is going to do what the US did in Iraq, where it took Baghdad with a shock and awe campaign and destroyed the capital city and destroyed its main institutions. For Russia to do that might make it impossible to either negotiate with the current Ukrainian leadership to get what it really wants in the East, and would also poison a post-war settlement. It may even be possible for Russia to accept a Zelensky in a neutral Ukraine. But the whole point of what I've been seeing and what I'm hearing from the experts we've interviewed at the Gray Zone, or that I listen to, and also just what I'm seeing, looking at very different media than I think a lot of Americans are seeing, including Ukrainian language and Russian language media, is Russia attacking the Ukrainian military, specifically trying to destroy the military and trying to avoid the cities, except in Mariupol, for two reasons. Number one, Russia needed to control the Black Sea and the Azov Sea, and Mariupol was a strategic port. And because of the presence of the Azov Battalion, that was the base of the Azov Battalion. And so that relates to Putin's rhetoric about denazification. And they have succeeded, it appears, in taking Mariupol. That's been the hardest fighting. And a lot of the city has been destroyed. But even there have been differences from what Russia did to Grozny and Chechnya. But, that's just too much detail. I think that my comments that I'm making now will hold up in a few weeks.
All right, I want to read Mark Peterson says, I really appreciate all the work you two do. I learned about both of you from a jack-off comedian in his garage. Take care. Jimmy Dore shout out. Let's see. Scroll. Tusker says, we need a call-in for this call-in. Yeah, I'll take a call in a second. As soon as these flip-flapping written comments are done. I'm a Phil American says, here's another $5 for listeners here tuning in who might be a bit too short to subscribe. That's very generous of you. Very camaraderie. Jeff Simmerling says, people who have never been slapped by a big man are the people who think that the slap was nothing. I don't believe Bria's ever been slapped. I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one. It's not that it's nothing, but it is what it is. It was a slap by a big man. It can be a bad slap. It can be the worst slap in the world. Well, it's not the worst slap in the world because I'd imagine the worst slap in the world would be blood and a fractured zygomatic arch and all kinds of other things that happen when you're slapped. It was bad. It's a bad thing to do. But if I throw this glass on the ground and shout at you in a fight, don't pretend it's equivalent to me taking a samurai sword and cutting your head off. These are just different things. They can both be bad things. They're just different things.
Well, since someone brought up Jimmy Dore, let me ask you this. I mean, Jimmy, his take on this is that Will Smith is legitimizing the physical assault of comedians, and that Jimmy.
I watched the video.
Yeah. What do you?
I think that's probably true. People shouldn't hit people. People shouldn't hit comedians. I mean,
everyone. I've seen a lot of comments. People saying Dave Chappelle needs to get hit next.
Yeah, I mean, it's not great. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, look, okay, so here's contrast it with this. There's this whole discourse that I got in trouble with last year about Nazi punching. Nazi punching, look, if you want to go punch a Nazi, I'm not going to waste my time and my breath arguing against punching a Nazi. I don't really, if that's what you want to do, and that's your version of civil disobedience, and you're willing to take your licks and go to jail for committing assault because you think there's this higher principle and have your Birmingham jail moment, God bless. Okay. But there's obviously something that is it's a moral subjectivity there that has everything to do about who you think is worth punching. That is the case when you're talking about punching Nazis. It's the case when you're talking about punching comedians. There are people who think that Dave Chappelle, because of the tenor of his jokes and the transphobia of his jokes, deserves physical assault. I personally am not one of those people. I also am not someone who personally subscribes to Nazi punching as the best way to de-radicalize people. That doesn't mean I like Nazis. That doesn't mean I agree with every joke that Dave Chappelle has ever made. But to me, because of the ambiguity, the moral ambiguity of it all, and the ease with which people can take that approach and apply it to any number of actors, who I do not think should be punched, like Jimmy Dore, I am generally hesitant to lean into that, especially since in the Nazi punching example, we don't have some like legions of lefty army folks that are going to protect you when the Nazis start punching back. And so it just feels like very risky to go out there and say, okay, now punching is okay, knowing that it's going to be weaponized against you and that we are usually the weaker party on the left who doesn't have the right ability to defend ourselves. And I feel similarly with this comedian punching scenario. There's going to be a comedian that gets punched that I don't think should get punched. And therefore, I don't want to open that Pandora's box.
Yeah, I think, comedians should come up on stage with a bat and just... but I mean, they're definitely going to have more bodyguards now.
Well, Jimmy said he's been punched before.
Yeah, he said he's been assaulted 3 times.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, the thing is, this is not like Will Smith didn't invent this. So like, I'm a little hesitant also about every instance of this that ever happens going forward is going to be attributed to Will Smith. And he's probably going to get some like kind of silly lawsuit about it at some point. So like, okay, fine. But yeah, it's not good. It's not good, but I think so much of the discourse has moved beyond the moral judgment of the initial slap because there've been all these other kinds of crazy claims. Like I saw one tweet that was like, I wish Will Smith had cared this much when they tried to strip him of his right to vote. Wait, what? Like there was a lot of, sorry, I didn't do identity politics, but there's a lot of hashtag white womening that was out here.
Oh man.
People were trying to make it into all kinds of things that it wasn't. And it was, and that makes you want to defend Will Smith, which is not a position that I was necessarily trying to be in the night up. Do you know what I mean?
Well, we witnessed I think we just witnessed kind of a demented psychodrama that wasn't just Will Smith and Chris Rock. It was Will Smith's own relationship and how he wanted to present himself. I thought his speech was completely insane, where he was like possessed by God and the devil simultaneously and was protecting Venus and Serena Williams and was sobbing. And I don't know, his wife confessed to cheating on him like live with, I don't even know if he knew about that before. So yeah. So, and Chris Rock's a little guy. I mean, he's just like
he's a little guy. Look, I strongly encourage everybody to listen to, I think the guest, Ole, who's been on the show, she's a public defender. She's come on to talk about, criminal justice issues and stuff, is literally the funniest person I've ever spoken to in my entire life. And with nothing other than wanting to have a break from all of this lefty politics stuff and have some levity, you should go listen to that. But also, like, I think it's good to talk to people who have some cultural background. Again, I'm not trying to do identity politics, but I was a little chagrined to see how everybody had these takes. All of these lefties on their YouTube shows have these takes that clearly just like discovered who Jada Pinkett Smith was yesterday and have none of the depth of like the factual basis to have a proper analysis. And like, I'm just saying there could be more Black content creators on the left that maybe you should patronize and get the full story here, because I haven't seen a better take. I haven't seen better coverage than we did on Call In the other night. But Jeff Simmerling, people who have never been slapped by a big, we already read that. Sorry. Can Bean says, did Schwab and his friends take a break because of Putin's resistance? I don't know that I get this reference.
Basically, Klaus Schwab, he's the chairman of the World Economic Forum in Davos, who's presiding over what he calls the Great Reset. And many people hold him responsible as like this architect of the whole COVIDian regime. And, there's this joke going around that Putin basically ended all the COVID restrictions because everyone stopped talking about COVID as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. I thought, the media did kind of take a quick exit ramp from COVID, like without saying anything about Klaus Schwab. They just found another deep event to propagandize people over, right, as the whole COVID narrative started collapsing. So that's definitely true. And then when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock, that like ended Vladimir Zelensky's whole stardom in the US. I mean, he was lobbying real hard to appear at the Oscars, and then, forget about it.
Oh, what we missed out on so narrowly.
Yeah, no, I kind of welcomed it. I'm like, good. Let's distract Americans with stupid celebrity bullshit so they'll stop supporting World War III. I think so. It would be smart of Zelensky to call Will Smith and tell him that Putin has his wife's name in his mouth, because maybe he'll finally get someone to intervene.
Hey, have you been following, by the way, speaking of this weird celebrity Russian entanglements, the Brittany Griner story, the WNBA player?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
It has been interesting to me that hasn't gotten more coverage. I mean, that could easily be she's our American sister and Putin's evil, another thing, but no one seems to want to touch it, which has some Black people very upset, by the way.
I saw some of the
yeah, go ahead.
I saw some of the kind of like identity obsessed Twitter personalities try to get it going as like Putin detaining a Black American woman just because he's a racist.
Was like Putin is specifically trying to catch a Black woman because they know that Black people matter so much to Joe Biden, and the whole thing was kind of insane. She's a special case. Golden Sun says, nice work, guys. 100, keep it up, punch up always. Thank you. Bobby Johnson, is there truth to the idea that U.S. could have made the protection of minority rights a condition of IMF disbursements the way they made them establish Anti-Corruption Bureau and chose not to?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Corruption Bureau was a joke, the same way it was in Honduras. The U.S. oversaw a Corruption Bureau there, and it was completely irrelevant. But the U.S. never prioritized minority rights in Ukraine, because when we talk about minorities, it's a little different than our understanding of them. There are minorities, though, in Ukraine, like Roma people who have been brutally attacked by state-sponsored neo-Nazi gangs like C-14. But we're talking about the Russian minority, and they're like a bare minority. They're like 30% of the population. In Mariupol, they're 40%, And the US saw them as the problem. I mean, the State Department sees ethnic Russians across Eastern Europe outside of Russia as one of its biggest problems in that area. And, we've exposed this at the Gray Zone with leaked files. Like BBC and Reuters they're running these intelligence kind of cutout operations to propagandize the Russian speaking public and try to kind of turn them against Russia and the leadership that they tend to be loyal to, because they present an opposition bloc in NATO-aligned countries like the Baltic states, for example. So in the Ukraine, when I mentioned this earlier, when Zelensky last year banned 3 opposition stations, which mainly catered to the ethnic Russian population, the State Department openly tweeted its support for that. So this is like, the US does not want democracy in Ukraine. It never did.
Tom Baer says Ukraine has 50% of the neon in the world that is needed for semiconductors. As an example, they should be able to have manufacturing and a great economy and great lives for their people. What's the holdup? Just the extreme levels of corruption?
No, I mean, Ukraine. I mean, this is a problem for Russia because Russia also has a lot of neon, as far as I know, but Russia doesn't produce semiconductors. It's going to have to figure out how to do that. That's one of the major problems I see with sanctions for Russia. But Ukraine, is one of the breadbaskets of Europe. It has, really important minerals, and they're not going to be arriving to the rest of Europe. I mean, Germany is really screwed. The government of Olaf Scholz, which has supported this. I mean, if you look at what was it, February 22nd, it was 2 days before Russia went into Ukraine. Olaf Scholz was at the Munich Security Conference, just puffing his chest out and denouncing Russia. And he sounded as warlike as any American. And now, I mean, his economy is tanking, inflation is soaring, and they're not going to get, food. There could be food shortages. There could be heating shortages. And that would mean, and in the US too, we're having fertilizer. There could be problems growing food. The food growers in the heartland of the US are already complaining because of sanctions on Russia, because so much of the fertilizers they depend on come from Russia. So, but Europe is going to feel it in a really extreme way. And Ukraine has been effectively deindustrialized by this war.
Hoot Burn says, kudos for asking the right questions, and to Max for taking fair questions in stride. Both of you keep speaking your truth in spite of the minders. Thank you, Hoot. Wynn says, remember the Syrian children refugees on the Turkish border? 2 winters ago, they were left freezing and disposable versus Ukrainian kids, all caps, criminals. Thank you for that. Tusker says, can you ask Max to give a Cliff Notes version of his interview with Scott Ritter on the Gray Zone?
No, that went on for 2.5 hours. And if anyone hasn't watched it though, and you want the highlights, look for the part when we ask Scott about Madeleine Albright, and he told one of the wildest spy stories I've heard in a while.
Is in the first half or the back half?
That's in the second half, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
She died live, it was live, and she died. So then I asked him, I was like, she's in hell, Scott. What do you think about her? She's playing.
Right. I didn't realize we were talking about Madeleine Albright, and I was like, oh, who died? And then I remembered. David again, Russia.
It was just heard.
Sorry. I was like, oh, who are we talking about so glibly? Oh, it's
David. David is really
they're gonna tonight.
Your enemies are gonna screenshot every comment with him and
Saul Good says, I just dig you both. Thank you, Saul. You guys are very engaged. I appreciate you. The call-in people aren't appreciating you right now because I'm prioritizing these YouTube comments a little bit, because I'm afraid that if I take a call-in call, it's not going to work. Tusker says, all right, Max, it's your turn to have Bree on the Gray Zone. Make this a cross-platform collaboration. Your move. I'd be happy to join.
Yeah, I think we should do when midterms roll around, we'll do a live.
I'd
If
love
if you'll agree, if you
I
would
love
oblige.
that. Midterms, that's my wheelhouse. David
Exactly.
thinks Will Smith should be in jail. This is not very lefty of you, David. Tom
That's a
Baer.
carceral solution.
Exactly. They've already worked it out, restorative justice style. They've all apologized and shaken hands and are going to be at each other's barbecues on Memorial Day. Tom Baer, Klaus is working on the food shortages so we can eat the bugs. I feel like I'm
The bugs meaning some of the meat replacements do incorporate insect protein.
Snowpiercer.
And that's something the World Economic Forum is advising now, is that people eat alternative proteins made from insects or lab grown meats in place of the meat that they won't be getting because of the economic catastrophe and food shortages that are inevitable. And, you can forgive people for being conspiratorial about a Great Reset when like it's spelled out years ago. And then we witnessed just a controlled demolition of the economy around the declaration of a pandemic, lockdowns, and now this war. So maybe Klaus Schwab is just like this brilliant visionary. But it really feels like we're entering into a new economic reality and people are just trying to make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lex Reason says, regardless of Putin's intentions, does Russia has the financial resources and weapons to do in Ukraine what the U.S. did in Iraq, Afghanistan? Thank you for what you do.
Do you mean to fully occupy? I mean, Russia has a different experience. Afghanistan was their Vietnam, and Chechnya was pretty horrible for Russia. So that's something I think Russia is trying to avoid. And its strategy is drawing on those lessons. And I remember reports of former Soviet advisors warning the US as it went into Afghanistan of what it was, that it was biting off more than it could chew. It was going to be bogged down and it would not be able to defeat an insurgency. And they were right. And they were right because they experienced the same thing. It contributed. It wasn't the main factor, but it contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
This is a good one from Nickelodeon. They ask, Max, please push back on the point Ro and others make that Putin wants the USSR back, and the quote, the dissolution of the USSR was a great tragedy. Thank you both. I didn't play that clip for you, but yeah, I said to him, look, I've had people on the show, on the call-in show, who said that they listened to that whole Putin speech and said that it was mischaracterized as him. It was overstated the extent to which he had these kind of empire building goals. What do you say to that argument?
Well, ask any like self-respecting Russian person of a certain generation who lived through the dissolution of the USSR, whether they think it was a great time or not, or was it a great tragedy? And there are polls. The majority of Russians think it was a complete catastrophe because of what took place afterwards in the 1990s, where a weakened Russia was pillaged by Larry Summers and his buddies, Anders Asland, and I think Jeffrey Sachs was involved. I mean, all these characters went to Russia, basically controlled the economic administration, looting all of the state pensions, deindustrializing the country. And you saw the weakest members of Russian society specifically, but Soviet society in the post-Soviet states, they lost everything. And the elderly just died. People descended into alcoholism and just would die in gutters, and men died in their 50s in gutters. There was a huge AIDS epidemic because of a spike in heroin use, because the opium and heroin was coming in from Afghanistan, because of the destabilization of that country by, the US after the Soviet Union left. Russian society was reduced to complete Mad Max level chaos in the 1990s. 3 to 5 million Russians died excess deaths. And this is a crime. It wasn't just, an organic thing that happened. It was a crime of capitalism and a crime on the level of Vietnam. And Putin lived through that. He turned out the lights at the embassy in Dresden, in what is now just Germany. It was East Germany. And that's what he was referring to. The idea that he has these kind of imperial ambitions. Well, I can't speak to what's in Putin's mind, but Russia doesn't have the capacity to restore the Soviet Union. And we can see in Ukraine how limited its ambitions are.
Yeah, a question that I asked Ro, because earlier in the conversation, I had in the bit about NATO expansion as a provocation of the invasion. He had said, well, I referenced Bush saying that Ukraine was going to be included in 2008, and Ro kind of dismissed that as like, oh, that's just something that was said. It wasn't a hard set in stone U.S. foreign policy. And so why is it that we take something like what Bush said as a throwaway that no one was supposed to have any reliance on, and Putin's random speech, which may or may not have been interpreted poorly in the first place, is supposed to be a be-all definitive, proof of what his ambitions are. And it just seems to be like, I can accept a lot of different outcomes, but I just require some consistency here. That's all I'm ever asking, is just like a modicum of consistency.
Well, it's also like ideologically makes no sense, because Putin is an anti-communist or a non-communist. He comes out of a specific milieu in St. Petersburg, where he was working for a capitalist mayor as his deputy, presiding over the privatization of that city. And the Soviet Union was a Marxist-Leninist. It was run along Marxist-Leninist lines. So this idea that he wants to restore an ideological empire is laughable. But I think that's too much for most Americans to understand. If you witnessed a lot of the resistance rallies where there were signs of Donald Trump portraying him as a communist with a hammer and sickle behind him, I mean, that's pretty much as far as the blue anon brain will allow.
People are just being so silly. Dave L says, nobody talking about Will Smith's beautiful technique. His left hand was defensively responsible and ready to show up with a cross. Has Thomas Friedman weighed in on it yet? Joke for you. Jeremy Nimmo says, an interesting coincidence. A week before videos of Russian prisoners of war being kneecapped by Azov came out, the Ukrainian SBU put out a faked call recording claiming Russian soldiers were shooting each other in the leg. I'm not sure I get that. Do you?
Well, there last week were videos that leaked on Ukrainian Telegram channels, actually showing Ukrainian forces outside of Kharkiv, which is a city that has seen lots of shelling and fighting around its exterior. They'd captured what I think was a Russian artillery unit. They blamed them for shelling their city. They brought them out of a van, and on camera, they just shot them one by one in their knees and then let them bleed out on the ground and filmed it and were taunting them. It was disgusting footage. And Russian POWs, that term was actually trending on Twitter that day because it was just so shocking. And people finally saw that the Ukrainian military was not this, democratic, heroic force that was like, what we imagine them to be, that they were just like every other military committing war crimes, and that Zelensky had lost control of his military and security apparatus. So Ukraine has been trying to, wage various information ops to try to push back on that and try to confuse people, to try to debunk the videos, even though they appear to be totally real. I mean, Zelensky's own advisor denounced them. And the reason that these videos are so significant is like, this kind of stuff leads to escalation. It could lead to crimes by Russian soldiers against Ukrainians as revenge. And it has driven morale inside Russia and among the Russian military.
Oh, I'm so glad for those of you, those people like you, Max, that are like following all of this stuff, because it's both a lot and really grim, and I'm sure it's taking a toll.
It all takes a toll, and it's my job. So like, to be fair to Ro Khanna or people like him, like they have to answer to their constituents and they have so many issues. They have to understand that maybe he doesn't have time to do what I'm doing. but I think that he should have better instincts when it comes to.
Yeah, and look,
boxing others.
this he could watch this stream. He could watch any number of videos that you've put out, any number of conversations that have been had by folks like you and Aaron, and
He could have better advisors.
yeah,
Like
it
he could have Bernie could have better advisors than Matt Duss.
Yeah, I'm grateful for him coming on the same way as I'm grateful to Ro Khanna for coming on. I really wish some of them would sit down with people like you. I just wish everyone could get in the same room together and the takes can rise and fall on their merits.
Well, I'll tell you about Matt Duss. Like I have sat in the same room with him. I've been around him. I've even been on a panel with him once, and he's always like, a nice guy, shaking my hand. How are you? Oh, very agreeable. And then, he goes and he wrote a scathing, an insane review of my book, Goliath, in this centrist, like neoliberal journal, actually kind of like defending Netanyahu. It was bizarre. And it was obvious what he was trying to do, which is just to appeal to future employers in Washington by kicking down the bad anti-Zionist troublemaker. So, there he got what he wanted.
Surprising, so confusing. Is this town really that big? Like you have the job with Bernie. Where else is there to go? Like you got one gig with the person who could maybe handle some of the takes.
The issue is like the Democrats don't have any room for a populist. They're scared of the people, and the Republicans do, or they have room for pseudo populism. So there's no room for like a Jimmy Dore type character in the Democratic Party. And those are the people that just ride herd on the American people, like their actual constituents. And everyone who wants a job in like a Democratic office or like or wants to run for office as a Democrat, they're appealing to like this elite kind of coastal intelligentsia. They're not democratic in that respect. Like that's why you have a Trump in the Republican Party. There's no similar figure among the Democrats who would just say like, fuck this war. Why are we sending weapons to Ukrainian Nazis? Why are we tanking our economy to fight this insane war? If someone said that, people would reward them. They would love them. The same way they reward us for saying this on a live stream, they would reward them at the ballot box, but no one running for office as a Democrat will get up and say that.
There were some Republicans who will say it. And I've said this recently, I think on Colin, that I started, I was binge watching some Fox News, just our highest performing videos on YouTube the other day to get a sense of what was being said. And what's interesting is that there is a ideological diversity on Fox. I mean, there's someone like Tucker who is anti-war and talking about all the domestic implications. And there's, so a whole host of the others that are very zealously advocating for sending more arms and complaining about Joe Biden not sending more and not doing more. And it's interesting that you get at least that much diversity over there. Whereas if you go on the MSNBC, CNN channels, it's like one person with 10 heads on one body.
Yep.
Might as well be, or vice versa. I'm not sure. Here's some levity. Tusker asks Max, do Kermit/Jordan Peterson voice before the stream is over.
I don't really watch Jordan Peterson, but that's kind of how I imagine. There's a war on boys today. We're seeing a war on men.
Is that the voice they wanted?
Wait, can you sing Rainbow Connection?
The lovers, the dreamers, and me.
Oh my God. That made my day. Oh my God, that's so good.
I was going to do that, but that's like a alt-right symbol. So I'll just.
Oh my God. How did you know you could do that? How did you figure out you could do a good Kermit?
I actually had our high school principal sounded exactly like Kermit the Frog. So I just started mocking him and it just went.
That's so good. Oh, I'm so delighted by that.
So does Jordan Peterson talk like that? I swear I've never listened to him. I just ignored him.
Yeah, kind of. It's lower pitched, but yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Eric asks, do you read Caitlin Johnstone? Everyone should. Wasn't there a bit of a pivot? Like, wasn't she very bad in like 2016 or?
No, I always liked her, and and she's, consistently gotten better and better. I think she's one of the clearest kind of anti-war, anti-imperialist opinion writers, and she writes just on her own site. She's based in Australia, but she said one thing that really offended a lot of progressives. I don't even know what to call them. In 2016, she said we should organize with people like Mike Cernovich because they're anti-war too. And then she quickly pulled back and apologized for saying it. And everyone was like, she wants us to organize with Nazis. No, she's Red Brown Alliance, Nazi Bowl, all that stuff.
No, that's not what I had in mind for why I can't remember why she was bad, but I have seen her tweets lately and they all seem very good. So it's been confusing to me.
I mean, I'm bad. Like a lot of people think I'm bad. So I don't even know.
I know.
I have a lot of problems with where the left is on a lot of issues. So I don't really, I don't know what people are referring to, what they're.
I mean, I shouldn't even say it because if I can't even substantiate it, I don't want to put that out into the ether. So, thoughts on, this is D-Die, thoughts on beer ICS, CBDCS, and 80% of all US dollars in existence printed since January 2020, and the US using this conflict as a distraction from hyperinflation?
Well, there are so many issues. I mean, BRICS is the kind of non-aligned states that, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are the most powerful sort of non-aligned states. I don't know what the question there is. What the I is really interesting because we saw India under Modi. We thought it was moving in more into the U.S. orbit. It became part of the Quad against China, but now India is remaining neutral and staying true to its historical role as a non-aligned state, is remaining neutral on Russia and is going to emerge as a really important trading partner of Russia, undermining the dollar as the world reserve currency and therefore undermining the main linchpin of U.S. empire. That's interesting to see. CBDC refers to central bank digital currency. That's I don't know how the issue relates to BRICS, except that you have crypto, it's run on blockchain, so it's disruptive. It is a threat to the, political order because central banks can't actually control the flow of money. That's why countries like Russia or Venezuela before it have tried to use crypto to circumvent US sanctions. Now, when central banks start implementing digital currency, and I think this is inevitable, cash is eliminated and they gain more control over their citizens' finances. And why a lot of people, I think, are correctly paranoid about this is because of what we just saw in Canada, where Justin Trudeau and his security apparatus froze the bank accounts briefly of people who donated to the trucker convoy there, basically froze the bank accounts of those he said were his political adversaries. That would be so much easier to do if the only currency is central bank digital currency. I know people more on the libertarian side are freaking out about this, but I think it should be a legitimate concern for anyone who is a dissenter, is involved in protest, real effective protest, not like the phony officially sanctioned protest.
Just say they did this to some Native American environmental protesters. I've heard him reference that before on his show.
I don't know. I'm sure that it has. I wouldn't doubt it. But one of the things I think people in the U.S. left aren't concerned about right now is how major cities have become fenced off to protest. And it's because those protests have been typically right-wing, like what's taking place in DC in the last few weeks, where there was a trucker convoy here. I actually went and interviewed them. I'm going to publish a piece whenever I get time about it. They were determined to have a peaceful protest in DC and to get out from under the shadow of January 6th. They were protesting the vaccine mandate. You can agree with it or disagree with it. That's not something I'm going to get into now. and they were blocked from entering the city by the Department of Homeland Security working with the DC police. They were basically prevented from protesting, and all permits they tried to take out were refused. And we saw what happened in Ottawa, where protest leaders and politicians or people who supported the protests are just being held as basically political prisoners. People on the left say, oh, well, they're fascist or like far right, so to hell with them. But no, this is just about the future of our ability to protest, period. And, I'm sorry the left doesn't really feel like getting out in the streets to protest anything right now, but maybe someday they will.
Yeah, so we did an episode a few weeks back. If people are interested, you can watch the video here on this channel or listen wherever you get your podcast with Andre Domise and Luke Savage and Ajamu Baraka. 2 out of 3 were Canadian. I still got comments mad at me that 3 out of 3 weren't Canadian. But we talked about all these issues. And with respect to the cryptocurrency issue, we did an episode with Grace Blakely, UK author, journalist at the Tribune, about whether or not the rise of crypto, the implications for the war in Ukraine. Ukraine was the 4th biggest crypto market prior to the war, and whether or not this is going to be the end of the, unipolar economic system, blah, blah, blah. It's an interesting episode. It was a lot of stuff, and she attempts to explain crypto to me for the second time. The Win Gap says, can Max explain the Russian military strategy for people? You guys are asking these like 45-minute questions. Can you, Max?
Well, I think I already did. So, if you just are tuning in, just get the, when it comes up on YouTube, just roll back. And I explained it pretty well. And I want to watch your Grace Blakely episode. And since you're in touch with her, I wanted to offer her a signed copy of my book, The Management of Savagery, because she went on Twitter and said it was the book of the year in 2019.
Oh.
Then deleted her tweet, denounced me, and blocked me after a bunch of British neocons told her that I was an Assadist. So
what are you doing to upset all these people, Max?
Well, I obviously interfered with her ambitions when she praised me.
Guys, can't we be like, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it, but what do you think psychologically it is about the left? Like, I was thinking about this the other day as I was cleaning my apartment. Like, what is it? There's always this rhetoric, this joke, this line that says the left eats itself. It can't get along. We've seen all these instances over the course of the past, basically since Bernie was out of the race. He was this unifying force. Everyone's mad, blah, 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 force the vote. And I was thinking, is there something intrinsic to left politics? Is it something about the kind of like constitution, the kind of like personality trait that's drawn to left politics?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, they're really different than the kind of people that are right-wing influencers. They care a lot about pedigree. They care about this idea of credibility, which means how seriously you're taken by mainstream or establishment media specifically, but also by establishment institutions. And they believe progress can only be achieved through those institutions by influencing them or marching through them. And so everything they do is to cater to those to their right or those in the center. And they wind up having to engage in hippie punching of people like me who don't really, I've given up on any of that. If I ever entertained those ambitions, those are long gone.
It's very confusing to me. And maybe people are like sometimes like, oh, Briahna, that's very bold or brave of you to have this person or that person on. And I think mostly I'm just ignorant. But I think another part of it is that I'm not like in the sphere. Like I was never someone who's trying to have a career in politics or even a career in journalism. I was a lawyer who anything I get now, anything that I can do that's not being a lawyer, I think is great. And I'm a happy camper. So I just think that maybe I am only benefiting from being a little bit outside of that structure. I don't think I'm better, I don't think I'm like braver or anything like that. But as an outsider to it all, it is really crazy to me. Like the way I saw Jimmy Dore's existence kind of weaponized against me and the Force the Vote movement as a whole. It was fascinating to me because I heard of the idea first from Sam Cedar, who was talking about it on his show. He said he had heard it from Jimmy Dore, and knowing that there's no love lost between those two, I thought, oh, this must be a good idea if even Sam Cedar is willing to say that Jimmy Dore is right about something. So let me look into it. I listened to it. Crystal Ball did a segment on it on her show. I said, oh, all of these people from across this like kind of political spectrum are really into it. Different styles of people are into it. I liked it. I wrote an article about it in December of 2015. I'm the only one who ever wrote a comprehensive articulation of the argument. I had many debates with people from Jacobin and all the prongs of the left. I obviously debated Sam Cedar about it. I was happy to have these dialogues and exchanges. And despite all of that, the number one thing that people say to me if I raise force the vote is that somehow Jimmy Dore is bad and therefore I'm not allowed to have a political opinion.
Yeah. And it feels kind of like high school, very juvenile.
High school, it's frankly really dismissive to my own intellect and ability to have thoughts and feelings. It disregards the time and effort that I put over my Thanksgiving and writing an article. Something that nobody else did was to put pen to paper and actually try to make a separate articulation of what the case was so that people couldn't just have it absorbed wholly into whatever personality problems that they have with Jimmy Dore. And it feels it is particularly, and again, I'm not trying to do ID poll, but the people who are doing this to me would very quickly say if the roles are reversed, that this is undermining a woman and subsuming her entire like worldview to that of a man and all of this stuff. And it's just crazy to me that like that is never, no one ever sees it that way. Like no one ever, it just boggles my mind to this day that in my opinion, it was me, Crystal, Jimmy, and Cornel West, and Kyle Kalinske. And there were a lot of big names in that cohort. And it's just, I think, really dismissive to the whole cohort to refuse to acknowledge how many people, major players on the left, in the left media world, were behind this, and political world were behind this. And I don't mean to like bring that up again, but it's just another example of how toxic this like blame by association is among a group that's supposed to be building a political coalition that it's definitionally a big tent.
Well, what is the left at this point? I mean, it's very guided by media personalities, online influencers, and it often becomes an argument about who is the good left influencer rather than a discussion of the issues. And I just notice among so many friends who've been involved in activism and left activism, anti-war activism, around the BLM struggles, whatever was identified with the left, going back to Occupy, they're all very disenchanted with what the left is. They're very alienated, so many of them, and they find it really hard to hang on or to participate as members of organizations like the alphabet soup of those socialist groups or even unions. One of the big driving factors for them was the left's response to COVID. And I feel like there's a brain drain taking place. And a lot of them do feel drawn to Jimmy Dore because he's not participating in in sort of left movement politics anymore. He's just kind of responding to where his audience is. He's going around the country, he's speaking to packed rooms, like packed theaters. And it feels, I mean, it's intense when you go to a Jimmy Dore show. And there are people from really across many political backgrounds. And I think that's where this country is going. So the idea that there are these, you can corral people into the left now and actually have any political success is a delusion, because it's only a few media personalities and maybe some movement leaders who are trying to shape where those barricades are. And the rest of the population has moved away.
I mean, I do feel like the left is there. Like the people are there, the same cohort that was there in 2019, 2016. Like they're still there. I almost do feel as though it's not that the Bernie movement got everybody together. It's more that it almost disguised the differences between some of the establishment left leadership, because all of the leadership got on board. So the people are still exactly where they were, ready to unify under someone who can, rise above this like layer of small media players who are in their factions. But it's like when Bernie went away, I think it did expose the what do you call them? What does Christine Liu call them? The professional managerial class of lefty podcasters. And I feel weird saying that because I have more degrees than I can pay for. But it does like constantly shock me how skittish everybody seems to be. and how unfriendly, I kind of just say as a human being, all these people who I thought were my friends and I genuinely liked just were so nasty
Yep.
because we disagreed about something, because you think, what, like I went on Jimmy Dore's show once and now I'm like a pariah. So that is part of why, like, I don't know, like you can't, you can't listen to anybody. You have to have everybody on. I mean, I'm gonna say you can't listen to anybody. I mean, you can't accept other people's criticisms, which makes my work harder, right? It makes the work harder that you can't just, there's very few people who I would trust just to tell me something, especially tell me something about someone and me take it on face value. And people have been frustrated with me as I'm learning about Ukraine and going through this process and interviewing any number of people. But to me, it's not the person. I'm not having the person on because they're going to propagandize to me. I'm going to take them at face value. It's because I literally feel like to understand anything, I have to have literally everybody on the show and just figure it the F out. Because what's the alternative? Who am I supposed to trust in the alternative?
Well, I think when I confront these issues, whether it's, whether it was Syria, Palestine, COVID, I try to meditate on it. I'll spend months researching it. I'll call people I thought I disagreed with. I'll do reporting on it, and I'll come to a point of clarity before engaging. And then I tend to just focus monomaniacally on the issue until I feel like I've made the impact I wanted to make. And I find that others, unfortunately, might not have the time to do that, whatever their motivation is.
Yeah.
They just defer to influencers, and this echo chamber forms. And then anyone who presents a different view, in order to consolidate their in-group identity, they demonize them. And it's easier to demonize people that they knew or who are closer to them within the left. And like intra-left disputes become a proxy or a substitute for actual politics. And that's, why I think we've both gone through an experience of painful personal experiences over the past few years, because the liberal consensus has completely collapsed. And then with it, the Bernie campaign collapsed, and a lot of people were left feeling rudderless, looking for someone or something to believe in. And they didn't really find any foundation. Ultimately, what happened to them, and what I think happened to a lot of people on the left, particularly during the pandemic, was they became, and after January 6th and after the Trump era, is they became sort of frightened of like a fascist threat or some, or however Jimmy Dore was presented to them by the Young Turks. And they wound up closing ranks with the liberal consensus. And you saw it in Canada too. Even like the radical left, they just close ranks with Justin Trudeau when some truckers come into town.
It's a credibility thirst. Everybody wants to seem credible. Everyone wants to seem like the serious person in the room. And sometimes I think that leftists are more vulnerable to it, because leftists are historically maligned as not pragmatic, as, unrealistic, as chasing utopias and all of this sort of thing. So if there's an issue, there's a split on the left, or you get to be the serious leftist, where you get to ally with, let's say, elected leftist representatives, as opposed to a faction of people like Jimmy Dore and myself and Crystal and Kyle who wanted to be adversarial. Well, then you're going to take that opportunity to seem like you got your big boy pants on, even though person after person, I'm sorry, everyone gets mad when I bring up the person, but person after person who to this day is arguing against it demonstrate they don't understand the basics of what was actually being advocated for, because they were so pompous. They never even read a single article or listened to anybody's coverage. It was all about identity and personality. And that's what's so frustrating and hurtful. It's not the disagreement. I disagree with plenty of people. I'm sure as I continue my education, there are things that were said tonight that I'll come to realize that I disagree with. And I'm sure that you wish I had pushed back better and more thoroughly and in different ways in the interview with Ro Khanna. But I just don't understand why that has to mean that we treat each other like pariahs. I want a world where, and I want to be respectful of this too, it is very hard when the hammer comes down on you to get called an Assadist and a Putin puppet and Red Brown Alliance and every other thing that we've been called. I'm personally responsible for there being no more abortion rights because I voted for Jill Stein in 2016. All of this stuff, it gets overwhelming. So I understand why some people are like, I don't have the bandwidth for this. I need to go take care of my kids and keep my head down and like delete my tweet about Max Blumenthal. Like, I'm not saying it's right. I understand emotionally that people are going to do what they're going to do, but it is frustrating because there is power in numbers and there's power in not backing down. Donald Trump should have taught all of us that. There's power in just not backing down and not apologizing for stuff that you don't think was wrong.
Yeah. No, I mean, you have to just, no one will respect you. And the people watching this will not respect you if they don't know where you stand. And you're not consistent. And I think that matters a lot. That really is what counts. That's real credibility.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people struggle to find consistency because issues are so confusing and there's so much propaganda. And one of the roles I've seen of the kind of establishment left is to provide confusion where there should be real clarity. And I mean, that's like one of the main roles the Young Turks is playing around the war.
What is their take over there these days?
Sorry?
What is their take over there these days?
Just like, just a straight up war party, like support Ukraine, give them all the weapons. They're fighting. They're selling like a shirt I saw at the Young Turks store that says like, fuck you, Russian warship. And it's quoting 13 Ukrainian border guards on this island, Snake Island.
Oh, the Snake Island shirt. I heard about
Except that the whole thing was made up and that the border guards were actually captured. That never happened. And so they're like trying to cash in on the war. Anna Kasparian went to the Munich Security Conference to interview all these NATO officials like days before. And there were anti-war protesters outside who were saying like, what we're going into, like, this is madness. Like, we need to pull back and negotiate. And all they do, I mean, I don't really take them that seriously, but it's just kind of an interesting window into the function of the establishment left, is to attack anyone on the left who is really making an impact and presenting a clear view that's inconvenient for the establishment. And so all the attacks that I've gotten, like the most vicious attacks, have been from people who technically qualify as left or progressive in the US. And they advance an establishment agenda or objectives, but with leftist or even a Marxist framing to attack me. You know, you're not respecting the agency of the Syrian people because I'm saying don't arm the insurgency. They use all that phony woke language. They can do it so much better than someone who comes from, you know, Center for American Progress. And so they're kind of like weaponized against the few of us that are doing what I think the traditional left always did, what drew me to left-wing politics, you know, being anti-war, being for civil liberties, being, you know, against capitalism and the free market. All of these have these traditional positions have become so confused in the past few years.
I know you're busy and I don't expect you to like listen to all of these episodes, but it's really remarkable. I've had so many people on the podcast, and again, I'm grateful for them coming on, but from lefty institutions.
Yeah.
Who I'm coming to this, I don't know anything about anything. You know, I am coming to this from an ignorant perspective, but I'm like, I thought the whole point was war is bad. Like, I'm really coming to it on this kind of a level. And to be confronted with interview after interview of people who I like and respect and come from backgrounds and institutions and political organizations that I like and respect, who unequivocally, like seemingly kind of unquestionably buy into what Ro was saying. He's not the only one here who thinks that this is an unambiguous moral requirement for us to
we take sides in a foreign war.
Exactly. And no one's asking that fundamental anti-imperialism question, which is why us? Yeah. The whole question of a just war is irrelevant on some level, not on a moral level, but on a should we get involved level. And no one is questioning America's continued role as the world's policeman. That should be the a priori number one step of the conversation before we get into, okay, then what's the litmus test for getting involved if we do decide that we should in some instances get involved?
That's why, and you know, this phony idea of internationalism has been conflated with, you know, Ro Khanna is presenting himself as an internationalist when he's just being an imperialist. And that's why people like Madison Cawthorn, who are like the laughing stock of all the intelligentsia in Washington, are presenting a much more clear and principled position on this than the squad. Madison Cawthorn said, Toby Keith said, if you mess with us, we put a boot in your ass. But, we're not defending American soil now. We are, fighting some foreign war for the military industrial complex. And like that, this isn't our fight. I'm forgetting his name now. There was an MMA fighter. I mean, everyone was put on the spot about Ukraine on February 24th. So some MMA fighter from Arkansas was asked at a press conference. I think you saw this.
Yeah.
And I mean, he gave the best answer. I think any American politician should give this answer, which is that I will fight on American soil against a foreign invasion. But Ukraine isn't my fight. And it seems like a corrupt country. Hunter Biden was cutting all these shady deals there. Why would I go and fight for them? And the way he received that question is so much different from the way that the kind of progressive brain of Ro Khanna does, because he just sees it as, will you fight for Ukraine? Ro Khanna doesn't think that way, because he doesn't, his buddies from his town or whatever, he doesn't have buddies from a town in Arkansas who went and fought in all these insane foreign wars and bore the moral injury and the physical injury of Iraq and Afghanistan. So he just thinks somebody else is going to do some fighting or some weapons shipping. And it's all just the way that most, that Americans, working class Americans think. And it's not just the white working class. Like Los Angeles County had some of the highest per capita casualties in Iraq. It was Chicano soldiers. Yeah. They just do not want to participate in these foreign wars. And they're the ones who are going to die, not these soft-handed neocons, not, the squad, what was getting up with their little Ukraine pins. But if this escalates any further, it's going to be a hot war.
There's a great episode of the West Wing. I was just going through my West Wing thread the other day. I hate watching it with the West Wing thing, guys. And they want some black Congress member to vote for some crap thing. And he's like, sure, I will vote for I think it's military spending or something, if you reinstate the draft. And they're like, what? And he's like, yeah, because it's my constituents that are going to go and fight this war. So I will agree with this cockamamie plan of yours, but only if you reinstate the draft. And because it's the West Wing thing, he's the bad guy in the scene. They're treating the black congressperson like he's the bad guy.
Yeah,
but it's delicious. He's like, yes. But first of all, that's how you do leverage. And some people up in Washington need to be looking at how you actually use a minority vote to extract some concessions. But it's classic. Look, it is so late. My phone's about to die on the call, and people are going to get kicked off. And I'm sure that they're very upset with me for having taken 0 questions. Also, there's all these questions on the screen. Joe Reddington said he loved the Ritter interview. McGregor interview was great too. Ree Albright in hell is the only reason Kissinger is still here, because hell won't take him. Well, you guys.
I'm afraid Kissinger is going to outlive me, along with Dick Cheney.
I mean, they've got the magic sauce. The same sauce is going to shoot him to the moon. Dan says, if EU saw Russia as a good neighbor, they tend to have better relations. As Russia becomes more entangled with China, the U.S. cannot allow that. Thank you for the comment. I'm so far behind. These comments are from like 1040. I'm sorry, guys. We got off on our own little tangent, but I really enjoyed it. It was cathartic. Tusker says, never mind on the Kermit voice. Too late. We did it. D Bulls Guy says, you all, Briahna, Max, Marianne, Katie, Crystal, Jimmy, Kyle, Aaron, et al. Are lights in the darkness. Somehow y'all need to get together and join forces. We do from time to time. I think Katie's doing a comedy show on the 10th here in DC. Marianne's going to be there for Julian Assange.
Katie once hosted me at her high school in New York for a talk.
At Dalton?
Yeah.
At Dalton? They let you at Dalton, Max Blumenthal? My goodness.
That was, it was another era in U.S. politics.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. The reception was pretty good.
I'm not surprised. We used to play them in volleyball sometimes. I was at a downtown school. Jeremy Ninmo. I'm sorry?
What school did you go to?
The United Nations School.
Oh, okay. A lot of my friends went to Hunter in New York.
Yeah, same.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. My parents taught at international school, so I went for free. Don't come at me over this private school stuff. Okay, Jerry Nimbo says, as a poor white guy from outside of the United States, I thank you both for standing up for my people alongside others within the American empire. No way forward without class solidarity across race. Thank you for that. David with the super sticker. David, the support, I'm feeling it. Phantom Phantom says Canadian Kermit equals that's Jordan Peterson. Gotta get Jordan Peterson.
I'm kind of a hoser. Hey.
It delights me so. Oh, John Flanders. I have become a follower of the two commenters of the Duran, interested in Mac's takes on them.
Yeah, that is, I mean, if you really want deep analysis of this Russia-Ukraine war and the economic implications, especially for Europe, those are two Europe-based commentators. It's called the Duran, and I really recommend it.
Okay,
and,
cool.
And shout out to John in Troy, New York.
All right. Think before you type says CIA said Putin advisors lied to him about Ukraine war, which reminded me of how the U.S. generals also lied about Afghanistan during the Pentagon Papers. Stephanie Welch says, glad to see a conversation between you both on the topic. Thanks, Max. How's Russell Texas Bentley doing? Have you heard any reports from him from Eastern Ukraine?
So yeah, Russell Texas Bentley is a former foreign fighter in the Novorossiya army, which is the People's Defense Militia of Donetsk, who lives 5 miles from the front line in Donetsk Republic. He's a guy from Texas, has a fascinating background, broke out of prison in Washington State after being jailed for selling marijuana, joined a lot of socialist organizations, is a hardcore communist who lives there now in Donetsk with his Russian wife, who told me that she is very worried about him. And he has been embedded with the, like as a kind of reporter with the Donetsk People's Republic forces. So I haven't had a chance to interview him again, but I interviewed him 48 hours before the Russian attack on Ukraine, and he predicted it to a T. So that's on YouTube still somehow. His entire YouTube channel was taken away from him.
These censorship ways. I'm interviewing Chris Hedges tomorrow. In fact, we're gonna also have to wrap because I have to finish reading his book tomorrow. But that should be an interesting one for Monday's episode. Again, like the video, subscribe to the channel. You can find us on Patreon for $5 a month to listen to Monday's episode. We give you 2 episodes a week. We give you 4 premium additional episodes a month, which is a lot more than some of these other podcasts do. I would have you know. AHDZ says, Max, have you heard of the Zapatistas, Chiapas? If so, thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually been to Chiapas before I was a journalist and spoke to some people about the aftermath of what took place there. The Zapatistas really staged the first rebellion against NAFTA and launched what I would call the anti-globalization movement. Like the day NAFTA was ratified, they took the town of San Cristobal. These are indigenous Mexicans from Chiapas. They were then targeted by the Mexican military, and there was a peace, basically like a peace treaty presided over by international monitors. And when I moved to LA in 2000, I became close friends with a number of people who were doing fundraising for the Zapatistas in Highland Park in Northeast LA at a place called, I think, the Popular Resource Center. And that's where actually Rage Against the Machine first started doing its shows and getting kind of known, was performing there. Zach De La Rocha was around there a lot. And Beck actually lived in the neighborhood and sometimes performed there. So it was an interesting time. And yeah, the Zapatistas are no more. Are you still there?
Sorry, I just have to plug my phone in.
So I've taken over Briahna's show. This is now Welcome to the Gray Zone.
So sorry, I just had to put my phone in because it's about to die.
I don't know why I didn't bail on. I mean, it's a good conversation, I guess, because we're heading up on 3 hours.
Yeah, you have no obligation to stay here. The thing with this call in too is you have to get one of these phone chargers that like your phone can sit on, because you can't plug it in while it's plugged into the road. So it's this crazy contraption, and this always happens. I was trying to get at the end of the comments, but you don't need to feel any obligation because more just keep coming.
Why don't you give me like 3 and I'll knock it out, and then
Okay.
I'll take off.
All right. Blockchain will restore personal financial sovereignty. That's not a question. Thanks, Golden Sun. Teresa says, have we all watched Victoria Nuland explain a regime change? Yes, it's embedded in the video of the episode that we're talking about. Go over there and also like and like that video too, so it does well on the algorithm. The BRICS nations are developing a SWIFT alternative called BRICS Pay, i.e. the US dollar is losing its position as the global reserve currency. The subject of the interview with Grace Blakely. I'm going to broker a reunion between Max Blumenthal and Grace Blakely. As I live and breathe. Golden Sun says Vicky's War. David, great job, Max. Tom Bear, Soviet deep battle doctrine explains in detail what Max was sharing earlier. Great. Thank you. Ideator says when Sam stated that he pulled back due to being asked by someone close to the matter, he lost the debate at that moment. Force the vote revealed the real left. He's alluding to the force the vote debate where he admitted that someone called him from somebody's office to tell him to lay off force the vote, one of these Congress people. So that's still on the internet. Tusker, it's not just COVID, Max. We are furious because we aren't being heard. Bernie is the PMC.
Well, he himself was, I think, co-opted by, I don't know if you want to call him PMC, but more like the foundationized left and the think tankers. And
go ahead.
2020 Bernie was different than the 2016 Bernie. He was, Donald Trump is a racist, like that kind of talk. Like it's not the kind of populist class analysis Bernie that I think brought a lot of people into his campaign who wouldn't have ordinarily even supported a Democrat.
Yeah. I'm a Phil American again. Would you ever have Jimmy on? I feel like there's been a growing deviation between the major aficionado leftist factions and grassroots activists. Jimmy seems like the biggest voice bridging that gap. Yeah, of course I would. Sorry, that's probably going to be clipped and people are going to be mad, but that is what it is. Of course I would. Who funds Gray Zone? Asked the Wasting Times.
Well, you can see we get a lot of support on Patreon, and anyone who supports us outside Patreon are like private friends of mine who are basically progressive Americans who support progressive media. And people always ask us that question because they're trying to imply that we have some like secret state funding from Russia or China. But I mean, the fact is, if we were even doing that, we'd be the subject of some kind of federal investigation. And like, I don't even know how to go about doing that. So as far as like the Gray Zone goes, it's basically like every other independent site that I've ever worked with. And like most of the people I know who give us any support, I know them through the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Like, just that's how I know them.
Mm-hmm. Who Burn says the right is just about as capable of infighting for all the usual reasons: ego, emotional thinking, being led to internal distress to protect both. They just have more TB dollars to get past it. Thank you. Dan Smith says, great interview. Why doesn't Khanna know enough about the Maidan coup and Nuland intervention to comment? Pretty sure he should know as much as I do. Yeah, I was surprised by that. I can't tell. I mean, I don't want to accuse him of being dishonest, because who would lie about being ignorant about something like that when you're kind of known for being the lefty foreign policy guy in Congress? Like, that makes you look bad to not know it, right? But it's also just very surprising. I almost, it's hard to believe that he wouldn't know. He said he read Mearsheimer or watched Mearsheimer videos, I forget which. It was confusing to me.
I mean, what? Yeah. I mean, it's sad. It's sad. But I really think it might be that he's not as ignorant as we think he is, and that he was trying to actually be clever by not knowing about this because of what he thinks the effect could be on his political ambitions.
Could be. Observer change.
I hope so. I hope he isn't that ignorant.
Either way, it's not a great look, as the kids say. Change the subject, Max. Have you seen Bad and Banada's video about Uyghurs and Xinjiang opinions?
I mean, I've talked about that issue, written about it. That's like one of those like bread tube type characters. Like, the Trotskyists who are advancing establishment objectives, but using like left pseudo-Marxist framing. And, my response would just be that like no one has debunked or discredited any of my factual reporting on that issue.
Okay. I'm a black box on that one, but I'm getting around.
Which is why, by the way, the State Department sent its cutouts after us. Literal State Department funded websites engaged in a coordinated attack on us over that issue in the Trump era when, Trump's State Department and specifically this guy, Matthew Pottinger, were trying to weaponize it against China and to gin up, more Cold War hysteria. Of course, there are some leftists who just provide the background noise for that.
Tusker, thank you for your nice comment about me, but I'm not going to read it because we're in a bit of a hurry, but it's very sweet. I'm a Phil American. Jesus, you guys are repeat offenders. I appreciate you. If the show ever had a Caleb Maupin on, you should reconsider naming it to Liberal to Marxist in 100 days. Come on, guys. Where's the questions at? Frank Scholes.
This is my last question because
okay, okay. No, I completely understand. We're at the 3-hour mark. The 26 odd bioweapons labs that Obama and Biden built in Ukraine are actual WMDs. That's not a question, but thank you for that. Tusker, don't beat yourself up over. Okay, Jesus Christ. Here we go. Do you think the problem with the left is a lack of effective leadership that creates a strong leftist movement? Thomas.
Well, we saw the weakness of Bernie and his potential. And Bernie was a living example of the importance of leadership, and he was weak. He was so weak that he allowed Biden to red bait him and defeat him. Joe Biden, Abe Simpson, he allowed to beat him in the last debate. He didn't have the killer instinct. He didn't want to defeat Hillary. He didn't go after her like he should have on Libya. That's what he should have gone after her on. And, at the same time, he did show the potential. I don't know if anyone has the same cachet as him or the same history to mobilize that many young people.
It was a once in a generation opportunity is what it felt like.
Yeah. So those are my last comments.
Well, thank you so much, Max. I don't know if you want to tell people again where to find you in your work.
Well, people know where to find me, but thank you so much for having me on. And, I wouldn't have stayed on if I didn't really enjoy the conversation. So I hope we can do it again.
I love that. I appreciate you. Have a good night and thank you.
You too. Peace.
Bye-bye. Remember, everybody, before you go, I'm still going to answer these questions, but make sure you like this video, like the stream, and subscribe to the channel, guys. We finally just hit 60,000 subs, but we obviously should be at like 500,000. So let's do that. Let's do that. And be sure to go and watch the actual Ro Khanna video that we're here ostensibly to talk about, and like that video as well so it gets traction. People are saying it's very important, and I do think it's very important. Like I said to Max, I wish that more of these candidates, these elected officials would go on other lefty channels and be challenged by people who are much more informed on the issues that I am. And I feel like I have a responsibility to use the fact that some of them will still come and talk to me and that I occupy this kind of neutral position to make asks that other people aren't in a position to make. And when I do that and have these opportunities, I really hope that they are seen more broadly. And so don't just make clips about this. If you do, please link back to the original video because I think people should watch the whole thing in context. I, of course, appreciate people making clips and discussing, but I want to encourage everybody to watch the whole interview. We haven't talked about the whole second half of the interview, in which we talk about the domestic policy issues, the fact that he said he thinks that Joe Biden is meeting the moment and was kind of critical of AOC's approach in her recent article where she was kind of ringing the warning bell. Please do like and subscribe. I'm going to get to the rest of these comments and then I'm going to take some call-in questions. Andrew Gruder, thank you for a very generous contribution. Says, very happy to see you both talking. What are both of your thoughts / worries about the U.S. allies taking revenge on other countries more economically attached for not playing the sanctions game versus Russia? I think you really want to ask Max this question and I'll pass it along. I'm sorry, Andrew, that we didn't get to you in time. Obviously, I think there's the same kind of concerns about imperialism as sanctions that we have in a lot of other contexts. Dusty Beer says, is it true that Max once drank 73 beers on a cross-Atlantic flight for beating Wade Boggs' record of 72? LOL. You guys are real cards. Okay. Did I do it? Did we clear it? All right. I'm gonna take a call-in caller. You guys have been so patient. Let's hear from Jay. Jay, what's on your mind? Unmute yourself and talk to me. Jay? Jay, unmute yourself. All right, I'm going to move on, Jay. I'm moving on. Anthony, you're the next caller. Unmute yourself and let me know what's on your mind.
Hey, what's going on? That was a great talk with Blumenthal. Wow, what a wealth of knowledge he is.
Isn't he? It's such a gift when I don't have to use my brain because there's someone I can defer to on the show.
Yeah, he's a walking encyclopedia. Him and Caleb Maupin too. These kind of guys, they're pretty good. But while we were talking about Ro Khanna so much tonight, and if the question was, is he stupid or lying? I mean, that's a really funny question to be in with these kind of people. And I really think this the squad and the quote unquote progressive caucus, which I think I heard earlier described as the squad, yeah, they'd be a minority faction in the Democratic Party, but the progressive caucus is like one of the largest caucuses in the whole building. So what's really going on? But I think they're the squad specifically. I think they're a little incompetent to be serious on these foreign policy issues, and I think they're really dangerous because they're selling this war. They all voted for the resolution that if you watch Max Blumenthal's interview with Massey, he said it was broadly worded, which included lethal aid to Ukraine and all that. They all voted for it. So they're not even anti-war, like in any respect. And they've all voted for sanctions on various countries. Some of them fewer than others, but they have no credibility in my view, especially when we want to talk about force the vote and Pelosi. Well, how about freaking Pelosi covering up for George Bush's torture? She was on the House Intelligence Committee, right? And then she's in an interview a couple of years later and says, "Oh yeah, I knew about it."
Yeah.
She said she didn't know the whole time. She said she didn't know about it. So I mean, like, there's just no integrity and like there's no alliance to be formed with these people that that you think you can. And Ro Khanna, yeah, you are a neocon. You were just you've been retweeting Bill Kristol and like chilling with him. It's ridiculous. So yeah, Ro, you are a neocon. And then it's ridiculous. The squad, in my view, they're just like Elizabeth Warren style consumer rights protectionists. That's really all they got going for them. And I, like I said, I got one local one here, and it's it looks like they run their office like a social security check mill, really. And like I've been watching, they just the last week or so they've been going around handing out Pat Sajak sized novelty checks with their pork that they got. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, that's great, but that's not really substantive. And you're giving it a lot of way to public-private partnerships, which is okay, it's fine. But and then you look at their stance on things bigger, like the Build Back Better. Well, okay, there's a lot of things I like in Build Back Better, but let's call it what they are: paid sick leave, paid family leave, child tax credit. Let's not call it Build Back Better because that's straight out of the World Economic Forum. It's a sick phrase. I don't know why anyone would be caught dead repeating that phrase, especially if they consider themselves a leftist. And then let's look at the infrastructure bill. I asked one of these squad members on a radio program, I said, how are you going to invest in our electric company? It's a private company. And they said, oh, we're going to force them to fix, the rundown areas first. I'm like, okay, but you're still going to invest in a private company. And talk about this CHIPS Act. They're pushing, silicone chips or whatever. And it's like, this is after decades of free trade, and now they want to do tax incentives for computer chips here. It's pretty. They have no cohesive position. Yeah. And then I also saw they're pushing insulin insulin caps right now.
Mhm.
But it's like, and they say we got to reel in big pharma. After the last 2 years, that sounds like a joke. So
Yeah.
these people have absolutely no credibility, and I think they're a little incompetent. And I think we should treat them as toxically as anyone else. I have no ally in the Democratic Party. Thank you, Bree.
Yeah, no, thank you. Look, your lay of the land is really depressing, and there's a part of me that like wants to see some hope and is sometimes lies in bed and thinks, well, maybe they just have their cousins in a cage with like a taser to them and they're threatening them with all these things. And that makes it better, but just trying to make sense of why no one, I understand why one or two people might not have backbone, but in the whole just stalled of all of them, nobody. And some of them have these great histories, right? You know, the video of Rashida Tlaib being handcuffed and dragged out of protesting some, and Cori Bush and her homelessness and all of these things are so genuinely admirable. It does make me think either they are bad people and it's fraud squad and all the stuff, or alternatively, the pressures are just so severe and so significant that there is absolutely no point in trying to operate within the system because even the best of us aren't doing very well. And it's hard for me to get around that conclusion. And I've talked to electeds, I go to some of these events. I even still give money to people from time to time because I see them and I talk to them and I see how they believe and they seem sincere and committed and they're trying so hard and it's such a struggle bus and they're these working class candidates and I feel bad. But it's I tell them like you need to be able to answer these kinds of questions if you want people to donate money to you. What are you going to do differently? Are you really aware of how bad it's going to be when you get in there? Are you willing to be adversarial to the Democratic Party publicly, not just in your heart of hearts? And it's not clear to me that anybody really understands that that's an advantage, and it's an advantage for them electorally and in fundraising context to announce that about themselves and to understand that that's what the dynamic is at play. But thank you so much for calling in, Anthony.
Mhm.
Let's hear from Andrew, but first I'm going to read this comment. No disrespect, because I do agree with most of their comment, but dude should write an article. I talk for, okay. All right. Okay, Andrew. You spent $50 to be mad at our caller friend. Andrew on Colin, Andrew on YouTube wants you to make it brief. So what's on your mind?
Well, I was just thinking this, to me, has sealed the deal, for my opinion, on Ro Khanna. I before was very skeptical of him, but now hearing, first of all, fantastic work you've done here. I really appreciate not only you interviewing Ro Khanna, but then having Max Blumenthal on. And I really, I think that your urge to want to get these people in a room together is admirable, and I share it. But I think I'm a lot more cynical than you are, and so I don't think that I know it.
Well,
And so,
I'm resisting it, Like
well,
look, I got
you
like
gotta do
Nathan
something,
Robinson
right?
and Glenn Greenwald talk to each other. Occasionally these people agree. What's his name? Michael Isikoff sat down with Matt Taibbi. It happens.
Yeah, I think Ro Khanna's got way more to lose in this scenario than in those examples. Personally, I just find that
Sure.
if he was in a room like that, he would be put into positions where I find him to be feigning ignorance. That's what I think, and I don't think that someone like Blumenthal would let him get away with that, or there would be some maneuver where he'd basically get him to have to answer questions in a genuine way, and he's going to have to side with the establishment, and that's just how it is. Now, as far as what I was going to say, the thing that tipped me to Ro Khanna just being full of BS on this is the families being killed thing, and there are so many other wars that are going on, and I haven't heard a fucking peep out of this guy because he doesn't care, because he's not told to care by the people that run his fucking. Excuse me, it just infuriates me, because this is talking about, it's not just that children and women are dying; it's that this freaking creep is out here using it as a way to pivot away and cause more women and children to die. And it's just insane to me. So I just really appreciate the work you've done, and I would wonder what your take is on specifically the prospects of a future anti-partisan alliance that's at least starting with an anti-war drive or mindset. I don't know. Do you know who Magnus Panvidya is, or the Stop End the Damn Wars march that took place in DC with him? Okay, I really highly suggest you look up. It's called the End the Damn Wars March. Max Blumenthal actually spoke here, and it was a collection of everyone from communists to libertarians, so-called Democrats and Republicans, conservatives. It wasn't very big, but I feel like it was the right spirit of things, and they just all spoke about all the different reasons that everyone across the political spectrum should be against these wars. And this was before Ukraine. This is a few months ago. I think this is around the Afghan pullout. But I mean, I just feel like that's the right way to do things, but it's extremely challenging, I understand. And I feel like you're the kind of person that really value reaching out and discussing things with people and forming unlikely alliances. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on that in a general sense.
I'm very positive on it. You know, I have
How do we
always
do it?
been well, I think that some of these nonpartisan alliances are easier than some of these intra-left alliances, just because you
Me
don't
too.
have some of those. Like, there's a certain kind of personality, right? I can't explain it. I'm constantly thinking about it. Like, why is it that I am not as offended by Jimmy Dore as other people? I understand if you're Ryan Grimm and he's like personally come for you or whatever, okay, but personal it's stuff aside. Like, why is it that I don't mind? Like, I can enjoy Jimmy or Kim Iverson or all these people without agreeing with every single thing they say. Why is it that I hear people talking about, JFK Jr.'s book and I think, oh, I'm curious, let me just read it, and I don't think the existence of the book is gonna like give me COVID. You know what I mean? Like, why is it that I seem to have this kind of like tolerance for these other opinions, whereas other folks take a view that, platforming this or listening to this or consuming this is a kind of a violence or is corrupting in a kind of fundamental way. There's almost like a fear of it. And I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I do find
I
people
think I
in
know why.
other why? You figured
Because
it out?
you actually have something to offer and you're trying to figure out ways to contribute. You have goals, and there's a lot of people that know that the best thing they can do is and this doesn't have to do with leftism exclusively. It's a thing about ideology and kind of religion or cults, where people that don't have as much to offer mentally or whatever it might be want to get ahead. And it's careerism, it's politics. They understand what the orthodoxy wants to hear, and they purge those who, even though they're critical thinkers and even agree with them a lot of stuff. This is why they attack people like you. They think they can elevate their own position, and you're a target because you actually have a platform.
Well, I do think there's a couple of things like that have happened. I don't want to name names because we buried some hedges, but there have been a couple of little random people who've taken some weird shots at me out of the blue for no reason. And I think that that's about like, it's just basic clout building, and that is what it is. But some of these other people, it's like, I don't know. I think it has to do a little bit with me feeling, rightly or wrongly, because I could just be delusional, right? I could just be an egomaniac or something, but having a certain degree of confidence in my own kind of North Star, that I don't feel like proximity to other views are gonna pollute me in some way. Like, I'm comfortable enough just consuming it, and so you can't evaluate it if you don't consume it. And there's people who are so afraid to get close to it that they never can really assess if there's any merit to it. And that, I think, is a real problem. And that's what
That's a great way
cancel
of putting it. They
culture
don't trust
is.
themselves.
Yeah, and that's why I think cancel culture does exist. It's not everything that's described as cancel culture isn't cancel culture, but that's what is insidious about this kind of thing, where it's like, I don't even want to hear it. I don't even want to. I'm not saying that everything has equal value and everything needs an equal platform. And obviously editorial decisions are made all the time in classrooms and in newspapers and all kinds of things. But you should hear it. The idea that you wouldn't want to hear what Max Blumenthal has to say, even if you end up disagreeing with it. The idea that you wouldn't want to hear what Ro Khanna has to say. A lot of people in the Patreon comments were like, I cut out after 10 minutes. I don't want to hear this. I mean, God bless you. If you want to pay me $5 a month and then not even listen to the content that you paid for, that's on you. It's a free country, sort of. But it also is like, I don't understand. I don't know. I just don't understand that mentality. It's like, I listen to Pod Save America. I listen to What's Left. I listen to Red Scare. I listen to Ben Shapiro sometimes. I mean,
If you were a fundamentalist Christian, how much time would you spend reading the Quran? That's how I look at this. This is, I really think people are finding their identity, finding their meaning, finding their morality finding their spirituality in a sense in the secular world, which I'm an atheist. I grew up in a Christian town. Trust me. I had my run with Christians. Okay. But there's something about it that seems like, because what you said was so good, like you trust your heart. Like you don't think that if you listen to some right wing, oh, well, I mean, I don't know what a good example is because you're a person of color, but you know, that you're going to become like self-hating or something if you listen to some right winger. And I feel like a lot of these people are maybe not in that place. You know, this is sounded pretty judgmental from my end, but I don't understand it either, particularly, other than in these senses.
Yeah. Well, I
But we got to
appreciate.
push past it for people that do have that ability and do an anti-partisan alliance. So I think we should start with people like you.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you ruminating about all of this with me today, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Let's see. Let's hear from Omar. What's on your mind, Omar? Oh, there you go. Unmute yourself and speak your truth.
Hey, Bree. Thanks for taking my call.
Of course. What's on your mind?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I'm of the Noam Chomsky school of thought where there's just certain things that you don't talk about, and people know it at some level. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that Ro Khanna isn't informed about the Palestinian issue. Like, they're not fighting as much for people of color, and like I'm just as cynical as Max about his motivations. I just don't understand like why people don't see it, why they keep on giving him the benefit of the doubt, or anybody else in office. I mean, there's $21 trillion of the Pentagon budget that is not accounted for. $21 fucking trillion. And we're still arguing about, like, you know, we can't pay for student debt relief, healthcare, housing, reparations.
Yeah.
Like it's just a crock of shit. Every time somebody mentions that we can't pay for something, we should throw in their face that the defense budget, the Pentagon budget, is just out of control, and this is just propping up a dying empire. It just, I mean, there's so many hidden budgets to the defense spending that aren't, they're not, there's no accountability, there's no transparency for us as taxpayers. It's our fucking money.
Yeah, what's interesting. Yeah. What's interesting is that when Max asked Ro the question, you know, on the street, if you wanted to pivot away from this, you could pivot away. If the specific issue of Ukraine you thought was too politically toxic, you could pivot away instead of to kind of these jingoistic talking points to a different conversation that's still a lefty conversation about how these war budgets are unjustifiable and how much there's been wasted military spending and how much we could fund at home and how we have to make sure we're still taking care of Americans. You could do that too, if you didn't want to talk about some specific question about arming Ukrainians. That is, I think, what Max's point was, and what I was trying to get across to Ro. It's like he wasn't literally calling you a neocon. The whole point is that we are surprised to hear you talking like this. This has not been your bag historically, and even to the extent that we have very low expectations for Democrats across the board. This was like hardcore. You sounded like a Republican. We're not saying you are a Republican, but you literally sounded like one. And there were so many ways to go. There's so many options for you in that moment. And you're a smart guy. You know, you're nobody's fool. And that's what's so confusing about it. We have a comment on the screen here from Brandon McNamara that says Ro Khanna is maintaining implausible deniability. And I think that kind of gets at it.
Yeah. I mean, I just wonder what happens when you go into like the office of the president. If you're elected, who sits you down, who talks to you? Same for the representatives. Like it just feels like there is something that they hold over them, that it's just like, it's mafia, like people in suits and they have respectability. I mean, but ostensibly, but they're acting no different than gangsters. I'm sure there's some like thinly veiled threats. I mean, it just is so surprising how much of a 180 AOC did when she got in there. Like the way she was talking, like right when she was elected versus now. It's just like, what? How do you explain that? Like institutional capture? I mean,
honestly, they look beat down. They look beat down, and that's not an excuse. I'm not trying to absolve them, but they look like they've been wrung through a ringer. And I remember I interviewed back in the day. I've interviewed ASU several times, and she struck me as sincere in those early days. And I would like it. I would like for them to trust left media enough to think that they could come to us and, blow that whistle, talk about what's been going on, realize that they have support if they're willing to kind of be honest with us and treat us as the allies as opposed to Nancy Pelosi, and realize that they do have power if they will align with the people. And I still hold out hope, perhaps naively, that might happen someday if they're pushed far enough. But if you're here in the middle of a Biden administration staring down this hellscape that is midterms, and you're still not trying to find allies with the people and in lefty media, and you're still not out here, with a line of diabetic kids talking about how corrupt our pharmaceutical industry is, and you're not using a platform to say, my millions of followers need to come for this student debt day of action on April 4th. I'll be there, by the way. Everybody should be there here in DC. I don't know what else you need to happen. World War III on the horizon. I don't know what else you need to happen to like push you into realizing you got to do something different. But thank you for calling in, Omar. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Take care. Let's hear from Gemma. I'm just going to take a few more of these and try to wrap by midnight. What's on your mind, Gemma? Unmute yourself and talk to me. Going once, Gemma. Gemma. Going twice. All right, let's hear from Sylvester. What's on your mind, Sly? While you're unmuting yourself, Sylvester, I'm going to read this comment off the screen. As bad as politicians are, the real problem is the electorate who continue to return these empty shirts to office. I wish I knew how to solve this problem, as do I. Sylvester, are you going to unmute yourself and talk to me, or have you gone off to the land of Nod? All right. Oh, there you go.
I was deciding.
You were deciding what?
I was on the fence about it, but I'm here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. What do you think about this evening? Why are you so contemplative?
What? Why? Because actually I'm driving to the skating rink. I didn't think I was going to get called up, but you got to have a little joy and fun while we, planning for the revolution. Did you talk to Astra?
Between last time she was on the podcast and now? I haven't. Why?
You haven't? Okay, because this, little strike coming up.
I know. I honestly haven't had time, guys. There's a lot going on.
I know.
There's a lot going on. And I would just like to say, for a record, I've heard through the rumor mill that some people are upset with me because they think that I'm ignoring them because I haven't responded to an email or said yes to doing some event or something. I promise you, I'm a disaster who was not responding to my grandmother. Please don't take it personally that I have poor executive function and start some crazy left feud just because I don't check my inbox. People are like trying to give me professional opportunities and send me money, and I'm not writing them back because that's how overwhelmed and stressed I am. So please, please, please don't take it personally. I have never intentionally ignored anybody in my life except for these roto dialers that I keep getting. But what's on your mind?
Because that's actually how I was feeling. I was feeling ignored. I had sent you some emails.
Guys, like, you're all sending me emails. All thousands of you are sending me emails. I don't know what you want from me.
No, I didn't even know you had an email. But I know now to never use it.
You have better odds of just adding me on Twitter and getting my attention.
Really though. But wait, we still talking about the episode. We've been talking about a lot.
We can talk about whatever you want to talk about, Sylvester.
I talk about whatever I want to talk about. Okay. You haven't talked about your dating recently.
Oh, come on.
Did you just give up? You said anything.
No, I haven't given up. I've had a very productive dating season. I've got some good prospects on the line.
Potential number one picks that you scouting right now?
I don't know. You know, I'm a fire sign, right? Here's where I lose everybody. Let's watch it go from 1,087 to 500 people online right now. You know, I'm a fire sign, and so I typically am very wary of water signs. I will say I've met a very alluring Pisces recently that's making me think that maybe I want a creative kind of, you know, artistic, literary type of soul, which is not something I've experienced before. I don't know that I've characterized any of my exes as romantic. So we'll see how that goes. It's promising. Sylvester, I think you muted yourself again. And while you're muted, I'm going to read this comment. What happened to AOC? She gets $100,000 for one speech. Power corrupts. I know this is a line. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But go ahead, Sylvester. Sylvester, I'm gonna have to go to the next. I'm a little concerned about your driving situation too. I think he's gone. Let's just take one or two more. Terry J123. What's on your mind?
Wait, can you hear me?
I can.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I've never used this before, so.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Bree.
Hello. What's on your mind this evening? What have you been thinking about this episode or
All right,
any of the other
so
subjects?
Yeah, I do. I have a comment. So, okay. About the squad and things like that, and even Ro. I just think, and I noticed it from the start, that in a way, these people are just like us in a way. I mean, I know that I didn't really I was okay, fine. I watched a lot of news when Obama was getting elected, but it wasn't until Bernie that I really learned a lot of stuff and went deep, like really deep, to the point where I watch your show. I mean, that's a compliment, by the way.
Mm.
And I think these people, I mean, they're young, you know. I think that's what it is that they're not as knowledgeable or as deeply knowledgeable as we maybe chalk them up to be or to have been from the beginning. And then on top of, and look, I am not defending them, but like, this is not like a thing where I'm like, you know, donating all the time to these people and I'm like they're, you know, super fans.
Yeah.
No, it's just that I really believe this. You know, that's what I think. There's a third thing. Yes, it could be that they're the two things that you said, you know, but I think there's a third thing too, and that they're learning as they go too. And then on top of that, they have that added experience of being in there. You know what I mean? So that we don't have at all. And I hope that by experience, that doesn't make it sound like I'm saying, you know, that it's.
No, I get what you're saying.
I don't know.
People say things like, you know,
Okay.
people say that I'm like covering for AOC or something when they'll say like, oh, you know, she said something, you know, wrong or whatever about some foreign policy issue. And they'll say, I knew that she never cared about X group of people. And I think that maybe, but also a lot of people are just like, I'm learning on the go all the time. Like people were mad about me about Ukraine 4 weeks ago because I was learning and figuring things out. And they took that as me just like believing the State Department talking point or whatever. And like, whatever, they've allowed me some grace to grow and evolve. And I think that that's the same case with these elected officials. I will say that elected officials, and I experienced this on the Bernie campaign, when you have a policy department and there are many, many people sitting at desks coming up with talking points and doing research, and you can ask them questions and they'll give you answers, it's a lot easier to be quote unquote right. It was so much easier being part of that institution to have confidence that Bernie's been in politics for 40 years. He's vetted these opinions. He's taken these stances. He has this integrity that he's built up over time. And you can lean on that infrastructure. And I miss it very much now. And I know some other people in Bernie world that are no longer under that umbrella are missing it too. And so that was on a campaign that was very well funded. These people, AOC and them, they have very small staffs. They're leftists, so they want to pay their staffs well. So oftentimes they'll have fewer staff members so that they can pay the ones that they have well. They're all overwhelmed. And like I've said before on the podcast, they don't have the benefit of the kind of think tanks that are writing a lot of the policy and stuff for neoliberals, because those neoliberal think tanks are putting out crappy neoliberal policy. So they're having to in-house a lot of the work with a smaller staff as compared to centrist politicians or conservatives. And so I genuinely do think they have a tough road to hoe. However, that is not to say that I wouldn't expect someone like Ro Khanna, who is known as like a foreign policy guy, who's on the Armed Services Committee, who has been in Congress for some time now. I expect him to know more about it than me, who just discovered Ukraine 4 weeks ago, you know?
I have to say one thing.
Yeah.
I haven't yet watched your video with Ro Khanna. I'm sorry I missed it.
It's okay. It just came out today at like 4 o'clock.
I can't even comment on Ro.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah. But I went and hopped on this without watching it, which I usually wouldn't have done. I would have just said, okay, I'll forego the live, you know, so that I could be up to date on, you know, everything. But I haven't watched it yet. So I can't comment on the Ro.
Well, don't worry. Don't worry. All you have to do, though, is hang up from this and go and at least like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And
already am.
Excellent. And then you'll get notifications when we do these live streams in the future. And also it'll help the video circulate. And maybe it'll just come across your feed tomorrow and it'll be a reminder that you need to go ahead and watch it. Because it's good and I'm proud of it.
Yeah, no, it's already on the YouTube. It's already on the YouTube though.
Okay.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's up on YouTube.
Yes. Something long?
Yes, it's about it's just under an hour. Right. Yeah, full video is up on YouTube now. Yep. Thanks for calling in, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, of course. I'm hopping around in the queue. So everybody look alive, be alert. I'm trying to take some new voices that I haven't heard before. Rudy, you're going to be the last caller. So make it good for the people. Unmute yourself, Rudy.
Hey, Bree, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Rudy?
Pretty good. Hey, I'm just like everybody else. I'm super happy that you're doing this. I think we need to figure out how to put a bit more power into left media, because you can't have left media feeding these guys, getting them into positions that they're in, like AOC, and then later on they go on to MSNBC, go on to all kind of crazy people who generally worked against AOC at the beginning. So I love that you're doing that. I think with the new candidates that are seeking your help, I think we should have, I think you guys should have a standard of, okay, if you're gonna ask me to give you a platform and, have you elected, after that, we have to have a way of getting you back so then you can talk to the same people that elected you. Mm-hmm. So then, because we can't keep getting used. And sort of in that same direction, I think it really bothers me whenever I come back to the States, because I get to the airport and then you have like this worship of soldiers, and I don't think that really helps us. So I'm wondering if we can get like some sort of offensive, basically have some sort of narrative change, because I can't remember what soldier has actually fought for anything decent for us to have this image of soldiers as nothing more than mercenaries. And I think it does not help us when we get to these wars, because, well, just like people, these people get into the military to get these benefits, and then they also get the benefit of being worshipped instead of being like pariahs for going out there and then bombing poor people for the corporations that are making our lives miserable. So like, can we try to fix this narrative that these mercenaries are, liberators? It's crazy.
Well, look, I think I would separate out the kind of structural critique of the military from the critique of individuals. Most people who enlist are doing it because they want healthcare or because they need to pay for college. And I'm a little uncomfortable, and they're putting themselves in harm's way, not for purely altruistic reasons necessarily, but at the end of the day are putting their bodies on the line and putting themselves in an unsafe situation for things that should be a human right, in my opinion. And I'm a humanist, and I have no quibble with having respect for them as human beings, first and foremost. And also to the extent that there ever was such a thing as a just war, or for them thinking maybe delusionally that they are going to fight for a just war. I respect the degree of courage that takes on some kind of a level. However, if we actually respected our military and we actually wanted to respect service members, we would take care of them when they came home, and we wouldn't send them to fight nonsense wars for resources and clout. And I think
Yeah,
that's the line we should be hitting. And there's so many veterans who are ready to be radicalized. Afeni, the activist who's been on the show before, she's working for Michaela Wilkes' campaign right now. She was on the steps and was reporting and doing a lot of interesting work with respect to the housing moratorium last summer. She's ex-military. We had this great guy, Kyle Bibby, on the Bernie podcast, who works with Common Defense, which is a leftist veterans group that endorsed Bernie Sanders. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush here, and I understand the impulse to see some of the jingoistic flag waving and the kind of faux empty hero worship. But as someone who is trying to build a broad coalition that includes a lot of these people, I also don't want to have a reactive approach to that at all diminishes the humanity of the people that are involved and the reasons why people enlist and the sacrifices that people do make, whether or not we believe they're making them for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying there's probably better words, than my calling them mercenaries. But I think the narrative right now, the force behind it is just so great that it is really harmful. It's I can't see how we get out of this maintaining this idea, for at least for us that know better, that know that the war on Iraq wasn't good or anything. I see so many people that are against the wars but still continue to consider these people not victims of the propaganda, victims of our criminals, rulers, but as heroes. I think there's a responsibility to say, yes, these people are not they're not
I hear
bad
you.
people, they're confused, but please, let's stop worshiping, at least if we understand that these people aren't the heroes that they think they are.
I hear you.
It's
I hear
crazy.
that. I hear that, Rudy. Look, I appreciate you calling in. You've given me some stuff to think about.
Bree, please, the next person you're gonna have on the platform, they need to be able to come back and justify their stuff. These people, I swear, they'll just use us forever if we don't stop. It's depressing.
Yeah,
But
so I have
love
some
your work.
candidate issues. Thank you. I appreciate you, Rudy. And I have some candidate issues coming up. I have a 2-in-1 episode that's going to post at some point next week. And the first half of the interview is basically me asking these questions about why should anybody care about this race. And I told them this before they came on. I'm like, I will platform you. We will talk about your race, and maybe people will want to give money to it. And I personally hope that you both win. But people can't ignore. They're wondering why fundraising isn't hitting like it was back in 2018. And it's because the left is in a different place and it wants to hear a different kind of messaging from its folks. And I want to be helpful to them, but I can lead a horse to water. I can't make them drink. And I think it was an interesting conversation. I hope people don't find it to be too pedantic. It's 12:08. I'm going to read this question off the screen. It's super random, but I'd love for you to do an interview with Marshall Kozloff. Keep up the good work and please take a break of stress. Thank you. I appreciate that. Free Food 89. How much more money do you need for an admin producer? That's an interesting question. I will be honest with you. At the peak height of this podcast, we had about 8,000 subscribers. That was maybe this time last year. And now it's the first of the month. Ooh, boy, so we're going to have a dip. But it's been under 6,000 for the last 2 month cycles right now. If it were back up to 8,000, I would 100% hire a producer. You know what I mean? An additional producer. But that's what it is. So support independent media. I would love to have more infrastructural help. I would love to be able to answer your emails. I would love not to have to do all of the posting and the clipping and all of that stuff myself. But, I also understand that times are tough and it is what it is. And I can't really complain. So Julian Henry, bus to go to the student debt protest from NYC, Philly, Lehigh, and Baltimore this coming Monday, and put a link to it. It's dsausa.us/cancel student debt. Thank you for that. Is that it? Are we through it all? You guys are lovely. I appreciate you. Okay, great, perfect. We're through it all. We've done 3 hours. There's still 900 of you hanging around. I hope you've all liked the video. Thumbs up the Ro Khanna video. Follow up the channel. Thank you guys all on calling. I know you didn't get as many calls in as you normally do for this dual stream, but Max suggested we do it on YouTube. He felt it was important to reach a broader audience, and I think that he's right. We did give you that bonus episode of Colin this month, though, this week with the slap. So don't say I didn't feed you. I hope everyone's doing well and taking care of yourself and staying in relatively good spirits. As always, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and keep the faith.